Chapter 17 of the Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 17. Devall's Bluff, Grand Reviews and Inspections, Surgeon J. P. Anthony, Private Press Allender, June and July 1864. I have said nothing so far about grand reviews or other functions of that sort, and here is as good a place as any to notice them. From some cause or other we had what seemed to us an undue proportion of grand reviews in Arkansas in the summer of 1864. They were not a bit popular with the common soldiers. It became a saying among us when a grand review was ordered that the reviewing officer had got a new uniform and wanted to show it, but of course that was only soldier talk. On June 10th, while in camp at Huntersville, all the troops at Little Rock were reviewed by Major General Daniel E. Sickles, late of the Army of the Potomac. He lost a leg at the Battle of Gettysburg, which incapacitated him for active service, so President Lincoln gave him a sort of roving commission to visit and inspect all the Western troops. In conducting the review at Little Rock, on account of his maimed condition, he rode along the line in an open carriage. The day was exceedingly hot. The troops on our side of the river were reviewed on low grounds where the air was stifling. We wore our jackets tightly buttoned, and we all suffered fearfully from heat. One man in the line near me went over with a crash all in a pile from sunstroke, and I heard that there were several other such cases. 9 days later, June 19th, we had Division Grand Review conducted by our division commander, General C. C. Andrews, and on July 11th another Grand Review by the same officer, and interspersed with the reviews were several brigade inspections of arms. But as those did not involve any marching, they were not as fatiguing as the reviews. I will mention specifically but one of these inspections, and do so for the reason that there were some things connected with it I have always remembered with interest and pleasure. It was held on July 4th at Devall's Bluff, the inspecting officer being Colonel Randolph B. Marcy, Inspector General, U.S. Army. He was a regular Army officer, a graduate of West Point, and at this time was about 52 years of age. He was over 6 feet tall, straight as an arrow, and a splendid-looking man in general. We had very short notice of this inspection, and having returned only a few days before from the Clarendon expedition, had not yet had time or opportunity to wash our shirts, and were in quite a rough and tough condition. And the fact that this inspection was to be conducted by the Inspector General of the United States Army, an old regular and a West Point graduate, made us nervous, and we apprehended all sorts of trouble. So far as I ever knew, the volunteers had not much love for the regular Army officers. We regarded them as unreasonably strict and technical, and were of the impression that they were inclined to look down on volunteers. Whether this feeling was well-founded or not, I cannot say, but there is no question that it existed. On this occasion we went to work with a will, and soon had our muskets, bayonets, belt plates, and accoutrements in general bright and shining, and in the very pink of condition. It was to be an inspection of arms only, and did not include knapsacks. About 9 o'clock in the morning of July 4th, we fell in on the regimental parade ground, broke into columns of companies, right in front in open order, and the greatly feared Inspector General entered on his duty. As already stated, we looked hard. Many of us were barefoot, and our clothes in general were dirty and ragged. But Colonel Marcy knew we had just come off a march. He was a very sensible man, and capable of making some allowances. In accordance with the regulations, he passed in front of us, walking slowly and looking at us critically. As he came opposite each soldier, the latter brought his piece into the prescribed position for examination, but Colonel Marcy contented himself with a sweeping glance, and did not take the musket in his hands. Then he passed to the rear of the ranks, and walked slowly along behind us, while we stood immovable, with eyes fixed to the front. It was soon all over. He then approached Colonel Orr, said something I did not hear, but which was evidently pleasant, for the Colonel smiled, then turned round facing us, and with a sweep of his arm in our direction said, loud enough for many of us to hear, "Good soldiers," whereupon we all felt much relieved and proud, and the dreaded inspection was a thing of the past. Several years afterwards, when in civil life out in Kansas, I learned that Colonel Marcy was not only a grand old soldier, but also a most interesting writer. I have 2 of his books in my library now, and have had for many years, one being his official report of the exploration of the Red River of Louisiana in the year 1852, the other 30 years of army life on the border. Both are highly interesting, and I frequently take them from the shelf and look them over. And when I do so, there always rises up on about every page the recollection of the tall, imposing figure of Colonel Marcy as he stood beneath the oaks at Devall's Bluff, Arkansas, on the morning of July 4th, 1864, and waved his arm toward us and said in a kind tone, and with approving look, "Good soldiers." There was in Company D an original sort of a character, by the name of Ambrose Presley Allender, for short, generally called Press. He was at this time, 1864, about 35 years old. He had been a private in a regiment of Kentucky infantry during the Mexican War, but what the length of his service may have been I do not know. But in his Mexican War experience he had at least learned every possible trick and device that could be resorted to in "playing off," as the boys called it, that is, avoiding duty on the plea of sickness or any other excuse that would serve. He was not a bad man by any means, but a good-hearted old fellow. He had re-enlisted along with the rest of us when the regiment veteranized, but his propensity for shirking duty, especially anything severe or unpleasant, seemed inveterate and incurable. He made me lots of trouble for some time after I became first sergeant. I was only a boy, and he was a man of mature age, about 15 years my senior, and looking back to those days I can see now where many times he pulled the wool over my eyes completely and induced me to grant him favors in the matter of details that he was not entitled to. But it was not long before I began to understand Press, and then, if he was excused from duty or passed over for a lighter job, the authority had to come from the regimental surgeon. Dr. Julius P. Anthony, of Brown County, Illinois, was appointed surgeon of the regiment in September, 1863, and remained with us in that capacity until we were mustered out of the service. He was not a handsome man by any means. He was hawk-nosed, with steel-blue eyes, and had a most peculiar, sort of high-keyed, nasal-tone voice, but he was an excellent physician, and a shrewd, accurate judge of men. So, when Press bucked up against Dr. Anthony, he found a foeman worthy of his steel, and the keen-eyed old doctor was a different proposition from a boy orderly sergeant. Press would keep close watch of the details as they progressed down the company roll, and when he was next in turn, and the impending duty was one he did not fancy, would then retire to his tent or shack, and when wanted for picket, or some laborious fatigue duty, would be found curled up in his bunk and groaning dismally. When we were at Devall's Bluff, at a time about the last of July, 1864, I discovered him in this condition one morning before sick call, when I went to apprise him, out of abundant caution, that he was next for duty and not to wander from the camp. He forthwith told me he was very sick, hadn't slept a wink all night, and that I must pass over him for the time being. I replied that if he was sick he must fall in at sick call, and have the surgeon pass on his case. So he climbed out of his bunk, put on his trousers, and made ready. Sick call was sounded pretty soon, and I went with Press and 2 or 3 of the other boys to the surgeon's tent. Press kept in the background until the other cases were disposed of, and then stepped forward. His breeches were unbuttoned down to nearly the last button. He was holding them up with his hands, and his stomach protruded like the belly of a brood sow. "Well, Allender," inquired Dr. Anthony, "egad, what's the matter with you?" Press was careful to put on all the military frills at such time, and he began thus: "Major Anthony, First Sergeant Stillwell has several times putten me on duty when I was not fitten for duty, and so I am now compelled to come to you and—" "That'll do, Allender," interrupted the doctor. "What are your symptoms?" Press then began the story of his woes. He had racking pains in his stomach, headache, couldn't sleep, all bloated up, he said, as you can see for yourself, with a comprehensive gesture toward his abdominal region, and numerous other troubles, including night sweats. Dr. Anthony heard him patiently and without interruption, but scanned him closely all the time he was talking. Press at last stopped to take breath, and then the doctor, in a rasping voice, spoke as follows: "Allender, the trouble with you is simply exercising too little and eating too much, and if you don't quit stuffing yourself and get around more, I shall instruct Sergeant Stillwell to put you on fatigue duty every day until you are rid of that mass of fermenting fecal matter in your bowels and your stomach is restored to normal condition. That's all." Then, addressing me, he said, "Allender's able for duty," and Press and I walked out. As soon as we were beyond the hearing of Dr. Anthony, Press turned loose. He was a terribly profane fellow, when in his opinion ordinary language would not do the subject justice, and had accumulated a stock of the most unique and outrageous expressions that could be invented, and all these he now fired at the doctor. Having no desire to put salt on a green wound, I said nothing. In perhaps an hour or so, the first sergeant's call was sounded at the adjutant's tent, which meant a detail. I responded to the call, and the sergeant major, consulting the regimental detail slip he held in his hand, told me he wanted a corporal and 5 privates from my company, with 2 days' rations, to make up a scouting party going up White River on a steamboat, and for them to report in 15 minutes. That caught old Press, and I went to his shack expecting a scene. He was found lying on his bunk in his drawers and shirt, as usual in such emergencies. I proceeded to detail him as one of the scouting party, and told him to be all ready within 15 minutes. In the meantime the weather had changed, and a disagreeable drizzling rain was falling. Press heaved a deep sigh when informed of his detail, and began to beg and protest. I told him that the doctor had refused to excuse him, that he was the next man on the roll for duty, that I had no discretion in the matter, and that he would have to get ready and go. But if he was feeling worse, I would go with him again to the doctor and request him to look further into his case. Press sprang out of his bunk with a bound and grabbed his trousers. "Before I'll ever go again," he said, "to that hawk-nosed old blankety-blank-blank to get excused from duty, I'll see him in hell further than a pigeon can fly in a leap year. He hasn't got sense enough anyhow to doctor an old Dominecker hen that is sick with a sore anus, much less a civilized human being. You could let me off this detail if you wanted to, and let me tell you, Stillwell, if this trip kills me, which it probably will, I want you to remember as long as you live that the responsibility for my death lies on your head." This last statement, I will confess, rather staggered me, and had it been delivered in a weak and pitiful tone, there is no telling what I might have done. But he didn't roar me as gently as a sucking dove, by a long shot, for his voice was full and loud and quivering with energy and power. So I made no response to this dire prediction. Press got ready and went. The weather cleared up in a few hours, and was bright and pleasant, but nevertheless I became very uneasy about Press. If the old fellow really was sick, and if by any possibility this detail should result in his death, why, then I felt that his last words would haunt me as long as I lived. I waited anxiously for the return of the scouting party, and when the whistle of the boat was heard on its arrival at the bluff, went at once to the landing to learn the fate of Press, and stood on the bank where the men could be seen as they came ashore. Presently here came Press, very much alive and looking fine. He bore, transfixed on his bayonet, a home-cured ham of an Arkansas hog. The tail feathers of a chicken were ostentatiously protruding from the mouth of his haversack, and which receptacle was also stuffed well nigh to bursting with big, toothsome yams, and later the fact was developed that his canteen was full of sorghum molasses. As he trudged up the road cut through the bank, his step was springy and firm, his face was glowing with health and beaded with perspiration. I felt greatly relieved and happy, and inspired by the joy of the moment, called to him, "Hello, Press! You seem to be all right." He glanced up at me, and in a sort of sheepish manner responded, "Yaas, as luck would have it, the trip 'greed with me." And from this time on I had no more trouble with old Press. He turned over a new leaf, cut out completely his old-time malingering practices, and thenceforward was a good, faithful soldier. We were in some close places afterwards, and he never flinched, but stood up to the work like a man. He was mustered out with the rest of us in September, 1865, and after some going and coming, settled down in Peoria County, Illinois, where he died March 15th, 1914, at the age of nearly 85 years. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of the Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 18. The regiment goes home on veteran furlough. Interview with General W. T. Sherman after the war. A short tour of soldiering at Chester, Illinois, August, September, October, 1864. After our return from the Clarendon affair, we remained in camp at Devall's Bluff, where nothing more important occurred than drilling, reviews, inspections, and the like. The summer was rapidly passing away, and still the regiment had not received the 30-day furlough promised us when we veteranized. Nearly all the other regiments in the department that had reenlisted had received theirs, and it looked as if the poor old 61st Illinois had been lost in the shuffle. The boys began to get a little impatient about this, and somewhat disposed to grumble, which was only natural. But on August 8th the paymaster made us a visit, paid us 6 months' pay and our veteran bounty, and then the prospect for the furlough began to brighten, and we were assured by our officers that we had not much longer to wait. And sure enough, on August 14th we started home. We left the recruits and non-veterans at Devall's Bluff, to which we expected to return on the expiration of our furlough, but the fates willed otherwise, as will be seen later. When we filed on board the steamboat that August morning, the old regiment, as an organization, was leaving Arkansas forever. I will say here that I have always regretted, and shall regret as long as I live, that after the capture of Vicksburg, the regiment happened to get switched off into Arkansas. We thereby were taken away from the big armies and out of the main currents of the war, where great deeds were being done and history made. Of course we couldn't help it, we had no choice, and, as I have remarked before, The common soldier can only do what those in authority direct. As connected with this subject, I will here tell the story of a little conversation I had with General W. T. Sherman at his office in Washington in February, 1883. I had gone to that city on a business matter, and while there met Colonel P. B. Plum, then one of the senators from Kansas. In the course of our conversation he asked if there were any of the big bugs in Washington I wanted to see. If so, he would be glad to take me round and introduce me. I replied that there were only two, that just as a matter of curiosity I would like to see President Arthur, but I really was very desirous of having a little visit with General Sherman. Plum laughed, said that my desires were modest, and made a date with me when he would take me to see the President and General Sherman. At the time appointed, we went first to the White House, where we met the President. I shook hands with him, and after a few commonplace remarks, retired to the background. The President and Plum talked a minute or two about some public matter, and then we left. "Now," said Plum, "we'll go and see Uncle Billy." Sherman was then the General of the Army, and had his office, as I now remember, in the War Department building, near the White House. On entering his office, we found him seated at a desk, writing. I had seen him previously several times, but had no acquaintance with him whatever. Plum introduced me to him, saying, as he gave my name, that I was one of his "boys." The General dropped his pen, shook hands with me heartily, and at once began talking. I think he was the most interesting talker I ever have known. He had lived a life of incessant activity, had done great things, and had mingled with great men. Hence, he was never at a loss for an engaging topic. After a while the monologue lulled, and gave me the opportunity for which I had been patiently waiting. "General," I began, "there is an incident connected with your military career during the Civil War that I have been wanting for some time to speak to you about, and, if agreeable, will do so now." "Huh?" said he. "What is it?" It was interesting and a little amusing to me at the time to see the instantaneous change that came over him. His face darkened, his eyes contracted, and a scowl appeared on his brow. His appearance and manner said, almost as plain as words, "Now here's a smart young Aleck who never had a greater command than a picket post of 3 men, who is going to tell me how he thinks I should have fought a battle." Resuming, I said, "Some years ago I read General Badeau's Life of Grant, and found published therein a letter from General Grant to you, written some time in the fall of 1863, when you were marching across the country from Memphis to reinforce him at Chattanooga, in which Grant said, in substance, 'Urge on Steele the necessity of sending you Kimball's division of the 16th Corps.' General," said I, "that meant us, it meant me, for my regiment was in Kimball's division, with General Steele in Arkansas. Now, my point is, I am afraid that you didn't urge Steele strongly enough, for we never got to you, and," I continued in a tone of deep and sincere earnestness, "consequently we missed Missionary Ridge, the campaign of Atlanta, the march to the sea, and the campaign of the Carolinas, and I shall regret it as long as I live." I noted with interest the change in the old General's countenance as I made my little speech. His face lighted up, his eyes sparkled, the scowl disappeared, and when I concluded he laughed heartily. "Didn't need you," he said, "had men enough. And let me tell you, Steele needed every d man he had." It was quite evident that the General enjoyed the recital of my little alleged grievance, and he launched into a most interesting account of some incidents connected with the campaigns I had mentioned. I became fearful that I was imposing on his good nature, and 2 or 3 times started to leave, but with a word or gesture he would detain me and keep talking, and when finally I did depart, he followed me out into the hall, and laying his hand on my shoulder in a most fatherly way, said, "Say, whenever you are in Washington, come and see me. Don't be afraid, I like to see and talk with you boys." And with a hearty shake of the hand he bade me good-bye. He was a grand old man, and we common soldiers of the Western armies loved him. In going home on our veteran furlough, the regiment went by steamer down White River, thence up the Mississippi to Cairo, where we debarked and took the cars and went to Springfield, Illinois, arriving there August 24th. The Mississippi was low, and our progress up the river was very slow. 2 or 3 times our boat grounded on bars, and after trying in vain to spar off, had to wait until some other boat came along and pulled us off by main strength. Near Friar's Point, not far below Helena, where there was a long, shallow bar, the captain of the steamer took the precaution to lighten his boat by landing us all on the west bank of the river, and we walked along the river's margin for 2 or 3 miles to the head of the bar, where the boat came to the shore and took us on again. Our officers assured us that our 30 days' furlough would not begin until the day we arrived at Springfield, so these delays did not worry us, and we endured them with much composure. On this entire homeward trip, on account of a matter that was purely personal, I was in a state of nervous uneasiness and anxiety nearly all the time. As heretofore stated, just a few days before starting home, we were paid 6 months' pay, and our veteran bounty, the amount I received being $342.70. Some of the recruits and non-veterans whose homes were in my neighborhood gave me different amounts that had been paid them, with the request that I take this money home and hand it to their fathers or other persons they designated. So when we started I had the most money on my person I ever had had before, and even since. The exact amount is now forgotten, but it was something over $1,500. Of nights I slept on the hurricane deck of the boat with the other boys, and in the daytime was mingling constantly with the enlisted men, and with all that money in my pocket. Of course I said nothing about it, and had cautioned the boys who trusted me with this business also to say nothing, but whether they had all complied with my request I didn't know. I kept the money, which, except a little postal currency, was all in greenbacks, in my inside jacket pocket during the daytime, didn't take off my trousers at night, and then stowed the bills on my person at a place, well, if a prowling hand had invaded the locality, it would have waked me quick. But I finally got home with all the money intact, duly paid the trust funds over to the proper parties, and then felt greatly relieved. When the regiment arrived at Springfield, we stored our muskets and accouterments in a public building, and then dispersed for our respective homes. I arrived at the Stillwell home the following day, August 25th, and received a hearty welcome. But the admission must be made that I didn't enjoy this furlough near as much as the individual one of the preceding autumn, for reasons I will state. You see, we were all at home now, that is, the veterans, and there were several hundred of us, and it seemed as if the citizens thought that they must do everything in their power to show how much they appreciated us. So there was something going on nearly all the time, parties, oyster suppers, and gatherings of all sorts. There was a big picnic affair held in the woods at the Sampson Spring, which was attended by a crowd of people. A lawyer came down from Jerseyville and made us a long speech on this occasion, in which he refreshed our recollection as to our brave deeds and patriotic services in battle and in camp and field generally, which was doubtless very fine. It is true I spent several very happy days at home with my own folks, but they were frequently broken in on by the neighbors, coming and going, who wanted to see and talk with Leander. And the girls, bless their hearts, they were fairly ready to just fall down and worship us. But I was young, awkward, and exceedingly bashful, and can now see clearly that I didn't respond to their friendly attentions with the same alacrity and heartiness that would have obtained had I been, say, 10 years older. The French have a proverb with a world of meaning in it, something like this: "If youth but knew, if old age could." But probably it is best as it is. When home on our veteran furlough a sad event occurred which directly affected the regiment, and which, it can be truly said, every member thereof sincerely deplored. This was the death of Lieutenant Colonel Simon P. Orr. He never was a strong man, physically, and the hardships and exposures incident to army life were really the cause of his death. He died at his home in Carrollton, Illinois, of a bronchial affection on September 14, 1864. He was a man of temperate habits, honest and upright, and a sterling patriot. As an officer he was kind, careful as to the wants and necessities of his men, and in battle cool, clear-headed, and brave. In due course of time Major Daniel Grass was appointed to the office of lieutenant colonel, to fill the vacancy thus created by the lamented death of Colonel Orr. The regiment rendezvoused at Springfield on September 26th, and left on the next day on the cars, went to St. Louis, and were quartered in the Hickory Street Barracks in the city. Another Price raid was now on. Only a few days previously General Sterling Price, with a strong force, including, of course, Shelby's cavalry, entered southeast Missouri, and the day we arrived at St. Louis he showed up at Pilot Knob, only about 85 miles south of the city, where some sharp fighting occurred. There was now the biggest kind of a scare prevailing at St. Louis, and judging from all the talk one heard, we were liable to hear the thunder of Price's cannon on the outskirts of St. Louis any day. We had been at Hickory Street Barracks only a day or two when my company, and companies B and G, were detached from the regiment, embarked on a steamboat, and went down the Mississippi to the town of Chester, Illinois, which is situated on the Mississippi at the mouth of the Kaskaskia River. We were sent here for the purpose, as we understood at the time, of guarding the crossing of the Mississippi at this place, and to prevent any predatory Confederate raid in that vicinity. We were quartered in some large vacant warehouses near the river, and had no guard duty to perform except a guard at the ferry landing, and a small one over our commissary stores. Altogether it was the softest piece of soldiering that fell to my lot during all my service. We had roofs over our heads, and slept at night where it was dry and warm. It was ideal autumn weather, and we just idled around, careless, contented, and happy. One lovely October day Bill Banfield and I in some way got a skiff, and early in the morning rowed over the river to the Missouri side, and spent the day there strolling about in the woods. The country was wild and rough, and practically in a state of nature. We confined our rambling to the river bottom, which was broad and extensive, and densely covered with a primeval forest. Some of the trees, especially the sycamores and the cottonwoods, were of giant size, and the woods abounded in nuts and wild fruits, hickory nuts, walnuts, pecans, pawpaws, big wild grapes, and persimmons, but the latter were not yet ripe. This locality was in Perry County, Missouri, and it seemed to be destitute of inhabitants. We saw 2 or 3 log cabins, but they were old, decayed, and deserted. We had brought some bacon and hardtack with us in our haversacks, and at noon built a fire and had an army dinner, with nuts and fruit for dessert. We got back to Chester about sundown, having had a most interesting and delightful time. There was another little incident that happened while we were at Chester, which I have always remembered with pleasure. Between companies D and G of our regiment was a strong bond of friendship. Many of the boys of the 2 companies had lived in the same neighborhood at home, and were acquainted with each other before enlisting. The first sergeant of G was Presley T. Rice, a grown man and some 5 or 6 years my senior. He came to me one day soon after our arrival at Chester, and in his peculiar nasal tone said, "Stillwell, some of my boys think that when we are soldiering here in God's country, they ought to have soft bread to eat. If D feels the same, let's go down to the mill and buy a barrel of flour for each company, and give the boys a rest on hardtack." I heartily assented, but asked what should we do about paying for it, as the boys were now pretty generally strapped. Press responded that we'd get the flour on tick, and settle for it at our next payday. To my inquiry if we should take Company B in on the deal, the other company with us at Chester, Press dryly responded that B could root for themselves, that this was a cahootnership of D and G only. Without further ceremony we went to the mill, which was a fair-sized concern, and situated, as I now remember, in the lower part of the town and near the river bank. We found one of the proprietors, and Press made known to him our business, in words substantially the same as he had used in broaching the matter to me, with some little added explanation. He told the miller that the only bread we had was hardtack, that the boys accepted that cheerfully when we were down south, but that here in God's country, in our home state of Illinois, they thought they were entitled to soft bread, so we had come to him to buy 2 barrels of flour, that the boys had not the money now to pay for it, but at our next payday they would, and we would see to it that the money should be sent him. While thus talking, the miller looked at us with narrowed eyes, and, as it seemed to me, didn't feel a bit delighted with the proposition. But maybe he thought that if he didn't sell us the flour, we might take it anyhow, so, making a virtue of necessity, he said he would let us have it, the price of the 2 barrels being, as I now remember, $7. I produced my little memorandum book and requested him to write the name and address of his firm therein, which he did in pen and ink, and it is there yet in that same little old book, now lying open before me, and reads as follows: H. C. Coal and Company, Chester, Illinois. Well, he sent us the flour, and D and G had soft bread the balance of the time we were at Chester. I will now anticipate a few months in order to finish the account of this incident. The spring of 1865 found the regiment at Franklin, Tennessee, and while there the paymaster made us a welcome visit. I then went to Press Rice and suggested to him that the time had now come for us to pay the Chester miller for his flour, and he said he thought so too. We sat down at the foot of a tree and made out a list of all the boys of our respective companies who, at Chester, helped eat the bread made from the flour, and who were yet with us, and then assessed each one with the proper sum he should contribute in order to raise the entire amount required. Of course the boys paid it cheerfully. Press turned over to me the proportionate sum of his company and requested me to attend to the rest of the business, which I did. I wrote a letter to the firm of H. C. Coal and Company, calling their attention to the fact of our purchase from them of 2 barrels of flour in October of the previous year, and then went on to say that several of the boys who had taken part in eating the bread made from this flour had since been killed in battle, or died of diseases incident to a soldier's life, but there were yet enough of us left to pay them for their flour, and that I here enclose the proper sum. I have forgotten in just what manner or form it was sent, but think it was by express. In due course of time I received an answer, acknowledging receipt of the money, written in a very kind and complimentary vein. After heartily thanking us for the payment, the letter went on to state that in all the business dealings of H. C. Coal and Company with Union soldiers, the firm had been treated with fairness and remarkable honesty, and they sincerely appreciated it. Many years later, out in Kansas, I met a man who had lived in Chester during the war, and told him the foregoing little story. He said he knew the milling firm of Coal and Company quite well, and that during the war they were the most intense and bitter copperheads, and had no use whatever for Lincoln hirelings, as Union soldiers were sometimes called by the butternut element. My informant was a respectable, truthful man, so it is probable that his statement was correct. It served to throw some light on the grim conduct of the miller with whom Press and I dealt, but they treated us well, and if they were of the type above indicated, it is hoped that the little experience with us may have caused them to have a somewhat kindlier feeling for Union soldiers than the one they may have previously entertained. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of the Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 19. Expedition to North Missouri. Back in Tennessee once more. Murfreesboro, October and November 1864. On October 14th we left Chester on the steamer A. Jacobs and went to St. Louis, where we arrived on the 15th and marched out to Michaelides Station, about 6 miles from St. Louis on the Pacific Railroad, where we found the balance of the regiment. There was a railroad bridge at this place over a small stream, and I suppose that during the scare of St. Louis it was deemed prudent to have a force here to guard the bridge. On October 19th the regiment left Laclede and went by rail on the North Missouri Railroad to Mexico in Audrain County, Missouri, about 110 miles northwest of St. Louis. Here we reported to Colonel Samuel A. Holmes, colonel of the 40th Missouri Infantry. We left Mexico October 21st and marched northward 25 miles to Paris, the county seat of Monroe County. There was a body of irregular Confederate cavalry, supposed to be about 500 strong, under the command of a Colonel McDaniel, operating in this region and carrying on a sort of predatory and uncivilized warfare. We learned that it was our business up here to bring this gang to battle and destroy them if possible, or failing in that, to drive them out of the country. Our force consisted of about 700 infantry, the 40th Missouri and the 61st Illinois, and a detachment of about 300 cavalry, whose state and regimental number I have forgotten. Our cavalry caught up with the Confederates at Paris and had a little skirmish with them, but before the infantry could get on the ground the enemy lit out as fast as their horses could carry them. We lay that night at Paris, and the next day, the 22nd, marched to the little town of Florida, where we bivouacked for the night. It was a small place, situated on a high, timbered ridge between the main Salt River and one of its forks. With the exception that it was not a county seat, it was practically a counterpart of the little village of Springfield, Arkansas, herein before mentioned. It had only one street of any consequence, and all up and down this street, in several places right in the middle thereof, were grand, imposing native trees, such as oaks and hickories. But the place was now totally deserted, and looked lonesome and desolate. I ascertained several years later that it was the birthplace of Samuel L. Clemens, the author, better known under his pen name Mark Twain. It is also an interesting circumstance that the first military operation conducted by General U.S. Grant was a movement in the summer of 1861 on this little village of Florida, with the intention and expectation of giving battle to a Confederate force in camp near the town. Grant's Memoirs, first edition, volume 1, pages 248 and following. The next day, the 23rd, we turned south and marched to the little town of Santa Fe, and the next day thereafter back to Paris, where we remained a day. On the 26th we went to Middle Grove, and on the following day again reached the railroad at Allen, some distance northwest of Mexico, where we first started out. It would seem that this little station of Allen has, since the war, disappeared from the map. At least I can't find it. On this expedition the infantry never caught a glimpse of an armed Confederate, but the object of the movement was accomplished. We kept after our foes so persistently that they left that locality, crossed the Missouri River, joined Price's army, and with it left the state. At this time the section of country over which we marched in the pursuit of McDaniel's command is now all gridironed with railroads, but in 1864 there were only two, the North Missouri, running northwest from St. Louis to Macon, and the Hannibal and St. Joe, connecting those two places and extending from the Mississippi River on the east to the Missouri River on the west. We always remembered this scout up in North Missouri with feelings of comfort and satisfaction. Compared with some of our Arkansas marches, it was just a pleasure excursion. The roads were in good condition and the weather was fine, ideal Indian summer days. And in the fruit and vegetable line we lived high. The country through which we passed abounded in the finest of winter apples, little Romanites and Jennetings being the chief varieties. The farmers had gathered and piled them in the orchards in conical heaps, and covered them with straw and earth sufficient to keep them from freezing. We soon learned what those little earth mounds signified, and, as a matter of course, confiscated the apples instanter. And the country was full of potatoes, cabbages, and turnips, on which we foraged with great liberality. If any apology for this conduct should be thought proper, it may be said that many of the farms were at this time abandoned, the owners having fled to the garrison towns to escape the Confederate raiders. Further, if we hadn't taken this stuff, our adversaries would, if by chance they happened again to infest that locality. Anyhow, a hungry soldier is not troubled in such matters by nice ethical distinctions. We remained at Allen on the 28th and until the evening of the following day, when we left there on the cars for St. Louis. But sometime near midnight the train stopped at Montgomery City, about midway between Allen and St. Louis. We were roused up and ordered to get off and form in line, which we did. Our officers then proceeded to give us careful instructions, to the effect that a band of Confederate cavalry was believed to be at Danville, out in the country a few miles south, and that we were going there to surprise and capture this party if possible. We were strictly enjoined to refrain from talking and singing, and to remain absolutely silent in ranks. We then fell into column and marched for Danville, where we arrived an hour or so before dawn. But our birds, if there when we started from Montgomery, had flown. There were no Confederates there. A party of guerrillas had been in the town about 2 weeks before, who had murdered 5 or 6 unarmed citizens, including one little boy about 8 or 10 years old, and it was believed, when we started to march out here, that this gang, or some of them, had returned. The party that had previously raided Danville were under the command of one Bill Anderson, a bloodthirsty desperado with no more humanity about him than an Apache Indian. He was finally killed in battle with some Union troops about the last of October, 1864. When killed, there was found on his person a commission as colonel in the Confederate Army, signed by Jefferson Davis, and the brow band of his horse's bridle was decorated with 2 human scalps. See The Civil War on the Border by Wiley Britton, Volume 2, page 546. He was of that class of men of which Quantrell and the James and the Younger brothers were fitting types, and who were a disgrace to mankind. Sometime during the day, October 30th, we marched back to Montgomery City, got on the cars, and again started for St. Louis, where we arrived the next day and marched out to Old Benton Barracks, where we took up our quarters for the time being. So we were once more tenting on the old campground, after an absence of nearly 3 years. But the place did not look as it did before. It seemed old and dilapidated, and there were only a few troops there. As compared with the active, stirring conditions that obtained there in February and March, 1862, it now looked indescribably dejected and forlorn. But our stay here this time was short. We left on November 5th, marched into St. Louis and down to the wharf, where we embarked on the steamer David Tatum and started up the Mississippi. We were puzzled for a while as to what this meant, but soon found out. We were told that the regiment was being sent home to vote at the ensuing presidential election, which would occur on November 8th, that we would take the cars at Alton and go to Springfield, and from there to our respective homes. We surely were glad that we were going to be granted this favor. The most of the states had enacted laws authorizing their soldiers to vote in the field, but the Illinois legislature since 1862 had been Democratic in politics, and that party at that time in our state was not favorably disposed to such a measure. Consequently, the legislature in office had failed to pass any law authorizing their soldier constituents to vote when away from home. We arrived at Alton about 9 o'clock on the evening of the 5th, and found a train waiting for us, box cars, which we at once climbed on. We had just got our guns and other things stowed away in corners, and were proceeding to make ourselves comfortable for a night ride to Springfield, when Lieutenant Wallace came down from the officer's caboose and stopped at the Company D car. "Boys," he called out, "get out and fall in line here by the track. The order to go to Springfield has been countermanded by telegraphic dispatch, and we are ordered back to St. Louis." "What? What's that?" we exclaimed in astonishment. "It's so," said Wallace in a tone of deep regret. "Get out." "Well, don't that beat hell," was the next remark of about a dozen of us. But orders are orders, and there was nothing to do but obey. The curses of the disappointed soldiers in thus having this cup of satisfaction dashed from their lips were not loud but deep, but we all swung down from the cars, fell in, and marched back to and on board the David Tatum, and were back at the wharf in St. Louis the next morning. We stacked arms on the levee, and the next morning, November 7th, left St. Louis on the steamer Jenny Brown, headed downstream. So here we were again on the broad Mississippi, duplicating our beginning of March, 1862, and once more bound for Dixie's land. By this time we had become philosophical and indifferent in regard to the ups and downs of our career. If we had been ordered some night to be ready the next morning to start to California or Maine, the order would have been treated with absolute composure, and after a few careless or sarcastic remarks, we would have turned over and been asleep again in about a minute. We had made up our minds that we were going to see the war through, and were determined in our conviction that we were going to win in the end. Election day, November 8th, was densely foggy, so much so that the captain of our steamboat thought it not prudent to proceed. So the boat tied up that day and night at the little town of Wittenberg on the Missouri shore. Mainly to pass away the time, the officers concluded to hold a mock regimental presidential election. The most of the line officers were Democrats, and were supporting General McClellan for president in opposition to Mr. Lincoln, and they were quite confident that a majority of the regiment favored McClellan, so they were much in favor of holding an election. An election board was chosen, fairly divided between the supporters of the respective candidates, and the voting began. As our votes wouldn't count in the official result, every soldier, regardless of age, was allowed to vote. But at this time I was a sure enough legal voter, having attained my 21st year on the 16th of the preceding September. You may rest assured that I voted for Uncle Abe good and strong. When the votes were counted, to the astonishment of nearly all of us, Mr. Lincoln was found to have 16 majority. As the regiment was largely Democratic when it left Illinois in February, 1862, this vote showed that the political opinions of the rank and file had, in the meantime, undergone a decided change. We left Wittenberg on the forenoon of the 9th, but owing to the foggy conditions our progress was very slow. We reached Cairo on the 10th, and from there proceeded up the Ohio, and on the 11th arrived at Paducah, Kentucky, where we debarked and went into camp. We remained there nearly 2 weeks, doing nothing but the ordinary routine of camp duty, so life here was quite uneventful. Paducah was then an old, sleepy, dilapidated, and badly decayed river town, with a population at the outbreak of the war of about 4,000. After our brief stay here terminated, I never was at the place again until in October, 1914, when I was there for about a day, which was devoted to rambling about the town. The flight of 50 years had made great changes in Paducah. It now had a population of about 25,000, 4 different lines of railroad, street cars, electric lights, and a full supply generally of all the other so-called modern conveniences. On this occasion I hunted faithfully and persistently for the old campground of the regiment in 1864, but couldn't find it, nor even any locality that looked like it. On the evening of November 24th, the regiment left Paducah on the little stern-wheel steamboat Rosa D, which steamed up the Ohio River as far as the mouth of the Cumberland, there turned to the right and proceeded to ascend that stream. That move told the story of our probable destination, and indicated to us that we were doubtless on our way to Nashville to join the army of General Thomas. There was another boat that left Paducah the same time we did, the Masonic Gem, a stern-wheeler about the same size of our boat. It was also transporting a regiment of soldiers, whose state and regimental number I do not now remember. The captains of the two boats, for some reason or other, lashed their vessels together side by side, and in this manner we made the greater part of the trip. In going up the Cumberland the regiment lost 2 men by drowning, Henry Minor of Company D and Perry Crotchet of Company G. There was something of a mystery in regard to the death of Minor. He was last seen about 9 o'clock one evening on the lower deck of the boat, close to where the two boats were lashed together. It was supposed that in some manner he missed his footing and fell between the boats, and was at once sucked under by the current and drowned. His cap was discovered the next morning on the deck near the place where he was last observed, but no other vestige of him was ever found. The other soldier, Perry Crotchet, stumbled and fell into the river in the daytime from the after part of the hurricane deck of the boat. He was perhaps stunned by the fall, for he just sank like a stone. The boat stopped, and a skiff was at once lowered and manned, and rowed out to the spot where he disappeared, and which lingered around there a short time in the hope that he might come to the surface. His little old wool hat was floating around on the tops of the waves, but poor Perry was never seen again. There was nothing that could be done, so the skiff came back to the boat, was hoisted aboard, the bells rang the signal, "Go ahead," and we went on. Minor and Crotchet were both young men about my own age, and had been good and brave soldiers. Somehow it looked hard and cruel that after 3 years' faithful service they were fated at last to lose their lives by drowning in the cold waters of the Cumberland, and be devoured by catfish and snapping turtles, but such are among the chances in the life of a soldier. On our way up the Cumberland we passed the historic Fort Donelson, where General Grant in February, 1862, gained his first great victory. There was at that time desperate and bloody fighting at and near the gray earthen walls of the old fort. Now there was only a small garrison of Union troops here, and with that exception the place looked about as quiet and peaceful as some obscure country graveyard. We arrived at Nashville after dark on the evening of the 27th, remained on the boat that night, debarked the next morning, and in the course of that day, the 28th, took the cars on what was then known as the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, and went to Murfreesboro, about 30 miles southeast of Nashville. Here we went into camp inside of Fortress Rosecrans, a strong and extensive earthwork built under the direction of General Rosecrans soon after the Battle of Murfreesboro in January, 1863. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 20. The Affair at Overall's Creek, Murfreesboro, December, 1864. The invasion of Tennessee by the Confederate Army under the command of General J. B. Hood was now on, and only a day or two after our arrival at Murfreesboro we began to hear the sullen, deep-toned booming of artillery towards the west, and later northwest in the direction of Nashville. And this continued with more or less frequency until the termination on December 16th of the Battle of Nashville, which resulted in the defeat of the Confederates and their retreat from the state. About December 3rd, the Confederate cavalry, under the command of our old acquaintance, General N. B. Forrest, swung in between Nashville and Murfreesboro, tore up the railroad, and cut us off from Nashville for about 2 weeks. The Union forces at Murfreesboro at this time consisted of about 6,000 men, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, but principally infantry, under the command of General L. H. Rousseau. December 4th, 1864, was a pleasant, beautiful day at Old Murfreesboro. The sun was shining bright and warm, the air was still, and the weather conditions were like those at home during Indian summer in October. Along about the middle of the afternoon, without a single note of preliminary warning, suddenly came the heavy boom of cannon close at hand in a northwesterly direction. We at once ran up on the ramparts, and looking up the railroad towards Nashville, could plainly see the blue rings of powder smoke curling upwards above the trees. But we didn't look long. Directly after we heard the first report. The bugles in our camp and others began sounding "Fall in." We hastily formed in line, and in a very short time the 61st Illinois and 2 other regiments of infantry, the 8th Minnesota and the 174th Ohio, with a section of artillery, all under the command of General R. H. Milroy, filed out of Fortress Rosecrans and proceeded in the direction of this cannonading. About 4 miles out from Murfreesboro we came to the scene of the trouble. The Confederates had opened with their artillery on one of our railroad blockhouses, and were trying to demolish or capture it. The 13th Indiana Cavalry had preceded us to the spot and were skirmishing with the enemy. Our regiment formed in line on the right of the pike, the Minnesota regiment to our right, and the Ohio regiment on the left, while our artillery took a position on some higher ground near the pike, and began exchanging shots with that of the enemy. The position of our regiment was on the hither slope of a somewhat high ridge, in the woods, with a small stream called Overall's Creek running parallel to our front. We were standing here at ease, doing nothing, and I slipped up on the crest of the ridge to see what I could see. The ground on the opposite side of the creek was lower than ours, and was open except a growth of rank grass and weeds, and I could plainly see the skirmishers of the enemy, in butternut clothing, skulking in the grass and weeds, and occasionally firing in our direction. They looked real tempting, so I hurried back to the regiment, and going to Captain Keeley, told him the Confederate skirmishers were just across the creek in plain sight, and asked him if I couldn't slip down the brow of the ridge and take a few shots at them. He looked at me kind of queerly and said, "You stay right where you are and tend to your own business. You'll have plenty of shooting before long." I felt a little bit hurt at his remark, but made no reply, and resumed my place in the ranks. But he afterwards made me a sort of apology for his brusque reproof, saying he had no desire to see me perhaps throw my life away in a performance not within the scope of my proper and necessary duty. And he was right, too, in his prediction that there would soon be plenty of shooting. I had just taken my place in the ranks when a mounted staff officer came galloping up, and accosting a little group of our line officers, asked, with a strong German accent, "Is this the 61st Illinois?" And on being told that it was, next inquired for Colonel Grass, who was pointed out to him. He rode to the colonel, who was near at hand, saluted him, and said, "Colonel Grass, the general sends his compliments with the order that you immediately deploy your regiment as skirmishers, and forthwith advance on the enemy right in your front." The recruits and non-veterans of the regiment being yet in Arkansas, its present effective strength hardly exceeded 300 men, so there was just about enough of us to make a sufficient skirmish line on this occasion for the balance of the command. In obedience to the aforesaid order, the regiment was promptly deployed as skirmishers, and the line advanced over the crest of the ridge in our front and down the slope on the opposite side. At the bank of the creek a little incident befell me, which serves to show how a very trifling thing may play an important part in one's fate. I happened to reach the creek at a point opposite a somewhat deep pool. The water was clear and cold, and I disliked the idea of having wet feet on the skirmish line, and looked around for a place where it was possible to cross dry shod. A rod or two above me the stream was narrow, and where it could be jumped, so I started in a run for that place. The creek bank on my side was of yellow clay, high and perpendicular, while on the other margin the bank was quite low, and the ground adjacent sloped upward gently and gradually. While running along the edge of the stream to the fording place, one of my feet caught on the end of a dead root projecting from the lower edge of the bank, and I pitched forward and nearly fell. At the very instant of my stumble, thud, into the clay bank right opposite where I would have been if standing, went a bullet fired by a Confederate skirmisher. He probably had taken deliberate aim at me, and on seeing me almost fall headlong, doubtless gave himself credit for another Yankee sent to the happy hunting grounds. It is quite likely that owing to the existence of that old dead root and my lucky stumble thereon, I am now here telling the story of this skirmish. By this time it was sunset and darkness was approaching, but we went on. The Confederate skirmishers retired, but we soon developed their main line on some high ground near the edge of the woods, and then we had to stop. We lay down, loaded and fired in that position, and nearly all of the enemy's balls passed over our heads. Presently it grew quite dark, and all we had to aim at was the long, horizontal sheet of red flame that streamed from the muskets of the Confederates. In the meantime, the artillery of both parties was still engaged in their duel, and their balls and shells went screaming over our heads. Occasionally a Confederate shell would explode right over us, and looked interesting, but did no harm. While all this firing was at its liveliest, I heard close by the heavy thud that a bullet makes in striking a human body, followed immediately by a sharp cry of "Oh!" which meant that someone had been hit. It proved to be Lieutenant Elijah Corrington of Company F. He was struck by the ball in the region of the heart, and expired almost instantly. He was a good man and a brave soldier, and his death was sincerely mourned. The affair was terminated by the 174th Ohio on our left getting around on the enemy's right flank, where it poured in a destructive volley, and the Confederates retired. We followed a short distance, but neither saw nor heard anything more of the enemy, so we finally retired also. We recrossed the creek, built some big fires out of dry chestnut rails, which we left burning in order, I suppose, to make our foes believe we were still there, and then marched to Murfreesboro, where we arrived about midnight. On the 2 following days, December 5th and 6th, the Confederates showed themselves to the west of us, and demonstrated most ostentatiously against Murfreesboro. From where we stood on the ramparts of Fortress Rosecrans, we could plainly see their columns in motion, with flags flying, circling around as if looking for a good opening. They were beyond the range of musketry, but our big guns in the fortress opened on them and gave them a most noisy cannonading, but what the effect was I don't know, probably not much. In the battles of the Civil War, artillery playing on infantry at short range with grape and canister did frightful execution, of which I saw plenty of evidence at Shiloh. But at a distance, and firing with solid shot or shell, it simply made a big noise, and if it killed anybody, it was more an accident than otherwise. Beginning about December 5th, and continuing for several days thereafter, we turned out at 4 o'clock every morning, fully armed, and manned the trenches in the rear of the breastworks, and remained there till after sunrise. It was a cold, chilly business, standing 2 or 3 hours in those damp trenches, with an empty stomach, waiting for an apprehended attack, which, however, was never made. For my part, I felt like I did when behind our big works in the rear of Vicksburg, and sincerely hoped that the other fellows would make an attempt to storm our defenses, and I think the other boys felt the same way. We would have shot them down just like pigeons, and the artillery in the corner bastions, charged with grape and canister, would have played its part too, but the Confederates had no intention of making any attempt of this nature. The official records of the rebellion, hereinbefore mentioned, contain the correspondence between Hood and Forrest concerning this movement on Murfreesboro, and which clearly discloses their schemes. The plan was simply to scare Rousseau out of Murfreesboro and cause him to retreat in a northerly direction towards the town of Lebanon, and then, having gotten him out of his hole, to surround him in the open with their large force of cavalry, well supported by infantry, and capture all his command. But Rousseau didn't scare worth a cent, as will appear later. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 21. The Battle of Wilkinson's Pike, December 7th, 1864. Early in the morning of December 7th, General Rousseau started out General Milroy with 7 regiments of infantry, which included our regiment, a battery of artillery, and a small detachment of cavalry, to find out what General Forrest wanted. Our entire force consisted of a trifle over 3,300 men. We first marched south from Murfreesboro on the Salem Pike, but gradually executed a right wheel, crossed Stone River, and worked to the northwest. We soon jumped up the Confederate cavalry vedettes, and a portion of the 61st was thrown out as skirmishers, and acted with our cavalry in driving back the scattered outposts of the enemy. Finally, about noon, we ran up against the main line of the Confederates on the Wilkinson Pike, protected by slight and hastily constructed breastworks made of dirt, rails, and logs. Their artillery opened on us before we came in musket range, and we halted and formed in line of battle in some tall woods, with an open field in front. We were standing here in line when General Milroy, with some of his staff, rode up right in front of our regiment, and stopped on a little elevated piece of ground. Then the old man took out his field glass and proceeded carefully and deliberately to scrutinize the country before him. My place in the line was only 2 or 3 rods from him, and I watched his proceedings with the deepest interest. He would look a while at the front, then sweep his glass to the right and scan that locality, then to the left and examine that region. While he was thus engaged, we all remained profoundly silent. His staff sat near him on their horses, also saying nothing. His survey of the country before him could not have lasted more than 5 minutes, but to me it seemed terribly long. At last he shut up his glass, returned it to its case, gave his horse a sort of haw pull, and said something in a low tone to the different members of his staff, who forthwith dispersed in a gallop up and down our line. Now, thought I, something is going to happen. One of the staff stopped and said something to Colonel Grass, and then came the command, "Attention, battalion! Shoulder arms! Face to the rear! Battalion about face! Right shoulder shift arms! Forward, guide center, march!" And that, I thought, told the story. The other fellows were too many for us, and we were going to back out. They probably had someone up a tree watching us, for we had hardly begun our rearward movement before their artillery opened on us furiously, and the cannon balls went crashing through the treetops, and bringing down the limbs in profusion. But as usual, the artillery hurt nobody, and we went on, quietly and in perfect order. After retiring through the woods for some distance, we gradually changed the direction of our march to the left, the result being that we executed an extensive left wheel and pivoted towards the left flank of the enemy. Here our entire regiment was deployed as skirmishers, and we again advanced. We later learned that the enemy had made all their preparations to meet us at the point where we first encountered their line, so they were not fully prepared for this new movement. General Milroy, in his official report of the battle, in describing this advance, says, "The 61st Illinois was deployed as skirmishers in front of the first line, and the line advanced upon the enemy through the brush, cedars, rocks, and logs under a heavy fire of artillery. Skirmishing with small arms began soon after commencing my advance, but my skirmish line advanced rapidly, bravely, and in splendid order, considering the nature of the ground, driving the rebels before them for about a mile, when their main line was struck." See Serial Number 93, Official Records of the War of the Rebellion, page 618. As we were advancing in this skirmish line across an old cotton field, the Confederates ran forward a section of artillery, placed it on some rising ground, and opened on us a rapid fire. The shot and shell fell all around us, throwing up showers of red dirt, but doing no harm. While these guns were thus engaged, I noticed a large, fine-looking man mounted on an iron gray horse near one of the pieces, and who was intently watching our advance across the field. He evidently was a Confederate officer, and I thought possibly of high rank. So, taking careful aim each time, I gave him 2 shots from Trimthicket, the pet name of my old musket, but without effect so far as was perceivable. After each shot he remained impassive in his saddle, and soon after galloped away. After the battle I talked about the incident with some of the Confederates we captured, and they told me that this officer was General Forrest himself. He was probably too far away when I fired at him for effective work, but he doubtless heard the bullets and perhaps concluded that he had better not expose himself unnecessarily. Our skirmish line continued to advance across the cotton field before mentioned. In our front was a dense thicket of small cedars, occupied by the Confederate skirmishers, and as we approached these woods our progress was somewhat slow. I happened to notice in the edge of the thicket, and only a few rods in my front, a big, heavy log which was lying parallel to our line and would afford splendid protection. Thereupon I made a rush and dropped behind this log. It was apparently a rail cut and had been left lying on the ground. A little fellow of Company H, named John Fox, a year or 2 my junior, saw me rush for this log. He followed me and dropped down behind it also. He had hardly done this when he quickly called to me, "Look out, Stillwell, you'll get shot." I hardly understood just what caused his remark, but instinctively ducked behind the log, and at that instant, whoosh, went a bullet from the front through the upper bark of the log right opposite where my breast was a second or 2 before, scattering worm dust and fragments of bark over my neck and shoulders. "I seed him a-takin' aim," dryly remarked little Fox. "Where is he?" I quickly inquired. "Right yander," answered Fox, indicating the place by pointing. I looked and saw the fellow. He was a grown man in a faded gray uniform, but before I could complete my hasty preparations to return his compliment, he disappeared in the jungle of cedar. An incident will now be described, the result of which was very mortifying to me at the time, and which to this day I have never been able to understand or account for. We had passed through the cedar woods before mentioned, and entered another old cotton field, and right on the hither edge of that field we came plump on a Confederate cavalry vidette, seated on his horse. The man had possibly been on duty all the previous night, and perhaps was now dozing in his saddle, or he never would have stayed for us to slip up on him as we did. But if asleep, he waked up promptly at this stage of the proceedings. All along our line the boys began firing at him, yelling as they did so. The moment I saw him, I said to myself, with an exultant thrill, "You're my game." He was a big fellow, broad across the back, wearing a wool hat, a gray jacket, and butternut trousers. My gun was loaded, I was all ready, and what followed didn't consume much more than 2 seconds of time. I threw my gun to my shoulder, let the muzzle sink until I saw through the front and rear sights the center of that broad back, and then pulled the trigger. Porting my musket, I looked eagerly to the front, absolutely confident that my vision would rest on the horse flying riderless across the field, and the soldier lying dead upon the ground. But to my utter amazement, there was the fellow yet on his horse, and like John Gilpin of old, going, like an arrow swift, shot by an archer strong. He had a small gad or switch in his right hand, with which he was belaboring his horse every jump, and the upshot of the matter was he reached and disappeared in the woods beyond without a scratch, so far as any of us on our side ever knew. How my shot happened to miss that man is just one of the most unaccountable things that ever happened to me in my life. I was perfectly cool and collected at the time, and my nerves were steady as iron. He was a splendid mark, at close range, and I took a deadly aim. And then to think that all our other fellows missed him too! It was certainly a thing that surpasses all comprehension. At the time I am now writing these lines, a little over half a century has passed away since this incident occurred, and it will here be recorded that now I am sincerely thankful that I failed to kill that man. Considering his marvelous escape on this occasion, the presumption is strong that he lived through the war, married some good woman, and became the father of a family of interesting children, and likely some one of his boys fought under the old flag in the Spanish-American War, so it is probably all for the best. But how in the world did I happen to miss him? Only a few minutes after this incident, I experienced the closest call, so far as can be stated with certainty, that befell me during my service. On this day it so happened that Company D was assigned a position on the extreme right of the skirmish line. This was not the regulation place for the company in the regimental line, and just how this came about I don't know, but so it was. As the first sergeant of Company D, my position was on the extreme right of the company. Consequently, I was the right-hand man of the whole skirmish line. We were continuing our advance across the field when we came on the vedette just mentioned, and all in high spirits. I had on a broad-brimmed felt hat, my overcoat, and beneath that what we call a dress coat, with the ends of my trouser legs tucked in my socks, was carrying my gun at a ready, and eagerly looking for something to shoot at. There was a little bunch of Confederates in the woods on our right that were sort of pot shooting at us as we were moving across the field, but we paid no attention to them, as the main force of the enemy was in our front. Suddenly I was whirled around on my feet like a top, and a sensation went through me similar, I suppose, to that which one feels when he receives an electric shock. I noticed that the breast of my overcoat was torn, but saw no blood nor felt any pain, so it was manifest that I wasn't hurt. It was clear that the ball which struck me had come from the right, so some of us paid attention to those fellows at once, and they soon disappeared. At the first opportunity after the battle was over, I examined my clothes to find out what this bullet had done. As stated, it came from the right, and first went through the cape of my overcoat, then through the right arm sleeves of my overcoat and dress coat, thence through the right breast of both these coats, and then through the left breast thereof, and from thence went on its way. All told, it made 9 holes in my clothes, but never touched my flesh. But it was a fine line shot, and had it been 2 inches further back, all would have been over with me. Just after this episode, as we approached a rise in the field, we came in sight of the main line of the enemy, in the edge of the woods on the opposite side of the field. The right wing of our skirmish line then took ground to the right, and the other wing to the left, in order to uncover our main line. It then marched up, and the action became general. The musketry firing on both sides was heavy and incessant, and in addition the enemy had a battery of artillery which kept roaring most furiously. We also had a battery, but it was not now in evidence. the reason being, as we afterwards learned, that it had exhausted its ammunition during the previous course of the day and had returned to Fortress Rosecrans for a further supply, but before it got back the fight was over. The engagement had lasted only a short time when the command was given to charge, and our whole line went forward. And thereupon I witnessed the bravest act that I ever saw performed by an officer of the rank of general. The regiment immediately on the left of the right wing of our regiment was the 174th Ohio. It was a new regiment, and had never been under fire but once before, that occasion being the affair at Overall's Creek 3 days previous. So when we started on this charge, I anxiously watched this big new Ohio regiment, for it was perfectly plain that if it faltered and went back, our little right wing of the 61st Illinois would have to do likewise. And presently that Ohio regiment stopped, and then we stopped too. I looked at those Ohio fellows. There was that peculiar trembling, wavy motion along their line which precedes a general going to pieces, and it seemed like the game was up. But just at that supreme moment, old General Milroy appeared on his horse right in front of that Ohio regiment, at a point opposite the colors. He was bareheaded, holding his hat in his right hand. His long, heavy, iron-gray hair was streaming in the wind, and he was a most conspicuous mark. The Confederates were blazing away along their whole line, yelling like devils, and I fairly held my breath, expecting to see the old general forthwith pitch headlong from his horse, riddled with bullets. But he gave the enemy very little time to practice on him. I was not close enough to hear what he said, but he called to those Ohio men in a ringing tone and waved his hat towards the enemy. The effect was instantaneous and sublime. The whole line went forward with a furious yell, and surged over the Confederate works like a big blue wave, and the day was ours. The Confederates retreated on a double quick, but in good order. We captured 2 pieces of their artillery, a stand of colors, and about 200 prisoners. We followed them a short distance, but saw them no more, and about sundown we marched back to Fortress Rosecrans. But before finally passing from this affair, a few other things connected therewith will be mentioned. As we went over the Confederate works on our charge, I saw lying on the ground inside a dead Confederate lieutenant colonel. He was on his back, his broad-brimmed hat pulled over his face, and a pair of large gauntlet gloves tucked in his belt. His sword was detached from the belt in the scabbard, and was lying transversely across his body. As I ran by him, I stooped down, and with my left hand picked up the sword and carried it along. I brought it to camp with me, kept it until we were mustered out, and then brought it home. Later a Masonic lodge was organized in Otterville, and some of the officers thereof borrowed from me this sword for the use of the Tyler of the lodge in his official duties. In 1868 I came to Kansas, leaving the sword with the lodge. After the lapse of some years there came a time when I desired to resume possession of this relic of the war, but on taking action to obtain it, it was ascertained that in the meantime the lodge building, with all its furniture and paraphernalia, including the sword in question, had been accidentally destroyed by fire, and thus passed away the only trophy that I ever carried off a battlefield. Many years later I met here in Kansas the late Confederate General John B. Gordon of Georgia, and had a long and interesting conversation with him. I told him the facts connected with my obtaining this sword, and of its subsequent loss as above stated. He listened to me with deep attention, and at the close of my story said he was satisfied from my general description of the dead Confederate officer that the body on which I found the sword was that of W. W. Billup, Lieutenant Colonel of the 29th Georgia, who was killed in this action. General Gordon also said that he was well acquainted with Colonel Billup in his lifetime, and that he was a splendid gentleman and a brave soldier. It has always been a matter of regret with me that the sword was destroyed, for I intended at the time I sought to reclaim it from the Masonic Lodge to take steps to restore it to the family of the deceased officer, in the event that it could be done. When the Confederates retired from this battlefield on December 7th, they left their dead and severely wounded on the field, as it was impossible for them to do otherwise. I walked around among these unfortunates and looked at them and saw some things that made me feel sorrowful indeed. I looked in the haversacks of some of the dead to see what they had to eat, and what do you suppose was found? Nothing but raw, shelled corn, and many of them were barefooted, and judging from appearances, had been so indefinitely. Their feet were almost as black as those of a Negro, with the skin wrinkled and corrugated to that extent that it looked like the hide of an alligator. These things inspired in me a respect for the Confederate soldiers that I never had felt before. The political leaders of the Davis and Toombs type who unnecessarily brought about the war are, in my opinion, deserving of the severest condemnation, but there can be no question that the common soldiers of the Confederate Army acted from the most deep-seated convictions of the justice and the righteousness of their cause, and the fortitude and bravery they displayed in support of it are worthy of the highest admiration. After the engagement of December 7th, the Confederates still remained in our vicinity, and showed themselves at intervals, but made no aggressive movement. Cold weather set in about this time, the ground was covered with sleet, and our situation, cooped up in Fortress Rosecrans, was unpleasant and disagreeable. We had long ago turned in our big Sibley tents, and drawn in place of them what we called pup tents. They were little squatty things, composed of different sections of canvas that could be unbuttoned and taken apart, and carried by the men when on a march. They were large enough for only 2 occupants, and there were no facilities for building fires in them, as in the case of the Sibleys. Owing to the fact that the Confederates were all around us, we were short of firewood, too. Stone River ran through the fortress, and there were some big logs in the river, which I suppose had been there ever since the work was constructed, and we dragged them out and used them to eke out our fires. They were all water-soaked and hardly did more than smolder, but they helped some. At night we would crowd into those little pup tents, lie down with all our clothes on, wrap up in our blankets, and try to sleep, but with poor success. I remember that usually about midnight I would freeze out and get up and stand around those sobbing, smoldering logs and shiver. To make matters worse, we were put on half rations soon after we came to Murfreesboro, and full rations were not issued again until the Confederates retreated from Nashville after the battle of December 15th and 16th. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Story of a Common Soldier, of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier, of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 22. The Fight on the Railroad near Murfreesboro, December 15th, 1864. On the afternoon of December 12th, the regiment fell in, and we marched to the railroad depot at Murfreesboro, climbed on a train of box cars, and started for Stevenson, Alabama, about 80 miles southeast of Murfreesboro. The number of the regiment who participated in this movement, according to the official report of Major Knowlton, was 150 men, and we were accompanied by a detachment of about 40 of the 1st Michigan Engineers. See serial number 93, Official Records of the War of the Rebellion, page 620. We soon learned that the train was going to Stevenson to obtain rations for the troops at Murfreesboro, and that our province was to serve as guards for the train to Stevenson and on its return. We had not gone more than 8 or 10 miles from Murfreesboro before we ran into the Confederate cavalry vedettes, who were scattered along at numerous points of observation near the railroad. However, on our approach they scurried away like quails. but in many places the track had been torn up and culverts destroyed, and when we came to one of these breaks the train had to stop until our engineers could repair it, and then we went on. Right here I will say that those Michigan engineers were splendid fellows. There was a flat car on our train, and on this car was a supply of extra rails, spikes, and other railroad appliances, with all the tools that the engineers used in their work, and it was remarkable to see how quick those men would repair a break in the road. They also were provided with muskets and accoutrements the same as ordinary soldiers, and when the necessity arose, as it did before we got back to Murfreesboro, they would drop their sledges and crowbars, buckle on their cartridge boxes, and grab their muskets, and fight like tigers. It was all the same to Joe with them. After getting about 35 miles from Murfreesboro, we saw no more of the enemy. The railroad from there on was intact, and we arrived at Stevenson about 10 o'clock on the morning of the 13th. The train was loaded with rations, and early on the morning of the 14th we started back to Murfreesboro, having, in addition to the force with which we left there, a squad of about 30 dismounted men of the 12th Indiana Cavalry, who joined us at Stevenson. The grade up the eastern slope of the Cumberland Mountains was steep. A drizzling rain had fallen the night before, making the rails wet and slippery, and the train had much difficulty in ascending the grade, and our progress was tedious and slow. This delay probably was the cause of our undoing, as will be revealed later. We didn't get over the mountains until sometime in the afternoon, and went along slowly, but all right, and about dark reached Bell Buckle, 32 miles from Murfreesboro. Here trouble began on a small scale. A Confederate cavalry vidette was on the alert, and fired at us the first shot of the night. The bullet went over us near where I was sitting on top of a car, with a sharp ping that told it came from a rifle. But we went on, proceeding slowly and cautiously, for the night was pitch dark, and we were liable to find the railroad track destroyed at almost any place. At 2 o'clock in the morning, just after leaving Christiana, about 15 miles from Murfreesboro, our troubles broke loose in good earnest. We encountered the Confederate cavalry in force, and also found the track in front badly torn up. We got off the cars, formed in line on both sides of the road, and slowly advanced, halting whenever we came to a break in the road, until our Michigan engineers could repair it. As above stated, they were bully boys, and understood their business thoroughly, and very soon would patch up the breaks so that the train could proceed. But it went only about as fast as a man could walk, and during the balance of that cold, dark night we marched along by the side of the track, skirmishing with the enemy. On one occasion we ran right up against their line, they being on their horses and evidently awaiting our approach. Luckily for us, their guns must have been wet. They nearly all missed fire, with no result save a lively snapping of caps along substantially their entire line. But our guns went off, and we gave the fellows a volley that, at least, waked up all the owls in the neighborhood. It was so intensely dark that accurate shooting was out of the question, and whether we hurt anybody or not, I don't know, but our foes galloped off in great haste and disappeared for a while. Shortly before daybreak, when we were within about 6 miles of Murfreesboro, we came to the worst break in the track we had yet encountered. It was at the end of a short cut in the road that was perhaps 4 or 5 feet deep. In front of this cut the track was demolished for several rods, and a deep little culvert was also destroyed. We sat down on the ground near the track, and our engineers went to work. The situation was like this. In our front, towards Murfreesboro, and on our right and left rear were cornfields, with the stalks yet standing, and on our left front was a high, rocky ridge, heavily timbered with a dense growth of small cedars, and which ridge sloped abruptly down to the railroad track. A small affluent of Stone River, with a belt of willow along its banks, flowed in a winding course along our right, in the general direction of Murfreesboro. While we were sitting here on the ground, half asleep, waiting for the engineers to call "all right," there came a volley of musketry from the woods of the rocky ridge I have mentioned. We sprang to our feet, formed in the cut facing the ridge, and began returning the fire. After this had continued for some time, a party of the enemy moved to our rear, beyond gunshot, and began tearing up the track there, while another party took up a position on the opposite side of the little stream on our right and opened fire on us from that direction. A portion of our force was shifted to the right of the train to meet the attack from this quarter, and the firing waxed hot and lively. Our engineers had seized their guns and were blazing away with the rest of us, and our bunch of dismounted cavalrymen were also busy with their carbines. This state of things continued for fully an hour, and I think some longer, when suddenly, coming from our left rear, a cannon ball screamed over our heads, followed by the roar of the gun. The commanding officer of Company D in this affair, and the only officer of our company present, was Lieutenant Wallace, and he was standing near me when the cannon ball went over us. "What's that?" he exclaimed. "It means they have opened on us with artillery," I answered. "Well," he responded, "let 'em bang away with their pop guns," and I think we all felt equally indifferent. We had become familiar with artillery, and knew that at long range it was not very dangerous. But the enemy's cannon kept pounding away, and pretty soon a shot struck somewhere on the engine with a resounding crash. About this time Colonel Grass gave the order to retreat. There was only one way of escape open, and that was down the track towards Murfreesboro. We hastily formed in two ranks, and started down the right side of the track in a double quick. As we passed out of the cut, a body of dismounted cavalry came out of the woods on the ridge to our left, and gave us a volley of musketry. But being on higher ground than we were, they overshot us badly, and did but little harm. We answered their fire, and their line halted. The command quickly went along our column to load and fire as we went, and keep firing, and we did so. We kept up a rattling, scattering fire on those fellows on our left, which had the effect of standing them off at any rate, and in the meantime we all did some of the fastest running down the side of the railroad track that I have ever seen. Speaking for myself, I am satisfied that I never before surpassed it, and have never since equaled it. But we had all heard of Andersonville, and wanted no Confederate prison in ours. To add to our troubles, an irregular line of Confederate cavalry charged on us through the cornfield in our rear, firing and yelling at the top of their voices, "Halt! Halt, you G D Yankee sons of ." Their remarks closed with an epithet concerning our maternal ancestors, which, in the words of Colonel Carter of Cartersville, was "very galling, sir." But, as said by the French soldier, old Peter, in the Chronicles of the Drum, "Cheer up! 'Tis no use to be glum, boys. 'Tis written since fighting begun, that sometimes we fight and we conquer, and sometimes we fight and we run." Occasionally we would send a bullet back at these discourteous pursuers, and possibly on account of that, or maybe some other reason, they refrained from closing in on us. About half a mile from where we left the train, the railroad crossed on a high trestle the little stream I have mentioned, which here turned to the left, and we had to ford it. It was only about knee deep, but awful cold. The Confederates did not attempt to pursue us further after we crossed the creek, and from there we continued our retirement unmolested. I fired one shot soon after we forded the stream, and I have always claimed, and in my opinion rightfully, that it was the last shot fired in action by the regiment during the war. I will briefly state the circumstances connected with the incident. In crossing the creek in some manner I fell behind, which it may be said was no disgrace, as the rear right then was the place of danger, but to be entirely frank about it, this action was not voluntary on my part, but because I was just about completely played out. Firing had now ceased, and I took my time, and soon was the tail end man of what was left of us. Presently the creek made a bend to the right, and circled around a small elevated point of land on the opposite side, and on this little rise I saw a group of Confederate cavalrymen 4 or 5 in number, seated on their horses, and quietly looking at us. They maybe thought there was no more fight left in us, and that they could gaze on our retreat with impunity. They probably were officers, as they had no muskets or carbines, and were apparently wearing better clothes than private soldiers. I noted especially that they had on black coats, of which the tails came down to their saddle skirts. They were in easy shooting distance, and my gun was loaded. I dropped on one knee behind a sapling, rested my gun against the left side of the tree, took aim at the center of the bunch, and pulled the trigger. Fizz, ker, bang, roared old Trim Thicket with a deafening explosion, and a kick that sent me a-sprawlin' on my back. There were 2 loads in my gun. My last preceding charge had missed fire, and in the excitement of the moment and the confusion and uproar around me, I had failed to notice it, and rammed home another load. But I regained my feet instantly, and eagerly looked to see the effect of my shot. Nobody was lying on the ground, but that entire party was leaving the spot in a gallop, with their heads bent forward and their coat tails flying behind them. Their curiosity was evidently satisfied. There is no mistake that I sent 2 bullets through the center of that squad, but whether they hit anybody or not, I don't know. At a point about a mile or so from where we left the train, we reached one of our railroad blockhouses, held by a small garrison. Here we halted and reformed. As I came slowly trudging up to Company D, Bill Banfield was talking to Lieutenant Wallace, and said, "I guess Stillwell's gone up. Haven't seen him since we crossed that creek." I stepped forward, and in a brief remark, containing some language not fitting for a Sunday school superintendent, informed Bill that he was laboring under a mistake. Soon after we arrived at the blockhouse, a strong force of our troops, having marched out that morning from Murfreesboro, also appeared on the ground. General Rousseau had learned that we were attacked, and had sent these troops to our assistance, but they were too late. He had also sent a detachment to this point the evening before to meet us, but on account of our being delayed, as before stated, we did not appear, so this party, after waiting till sometime after sunset, marched back to Murfreesboro. In this affair we lost in killed, wounded, and prisoners about half the regiment, including Colonel Grass, who was captured. He was a heavy-set man, somewhat fleshy, and at this time a little over 40 years old. He became completely exhausted on our retreat, being on foot, tumbled over, and the Confederates got him. Many years later, when we were both living in Kansas, I had an interesting conversation with him about this affair. He told me that his sole reason for ordering the retreat was that he had ascertained shortly before the artillery opened on us that our cartridges were almost exhausted. Then, when our assailants brought their artillery into play, he realized, he said, that the train was doomed, that it would soon be knocked to pieces, and also set on fire by the balls and shells of the enemy, and that we were powerless to prevent it. Under these circumstances he deemed it his duty to give up the train and save his men if possible. Colonel Grass was a good and brave man, and I have no doubt that he acted in this matter according to his sincere convictions of duty. The Confederate commander in this action was General L. S. Ross of Texas, who after the war served 2 terms as governor of that state. All his men were Texans, with the possible exception of the artillery, and according to the official reports were more than 3 times our number. I think it is permissible to here quote a small portion of the official report made by General Ross of this engagement, as found on page 771, serial number 93, official records of the War of the Rebellion. Speaking of our defense of the train, he says, "The men guarding it fought desperately for over an hour, having a strong position in a cut of the railroad, but were finally routed by a most gallant charge of the 6th Texas, supported by the 3rd Texas." End of quote. While the tribute thus paid by General Ross to the manner of our defense is appreciated, nevertheless I will say that he is absolutely wrong in saying that we were routed by the charge he mentions. We retreated simply and solely in obedience to the orders of Colonel Grass, our commander, and neither the 6th Texas nor the 3rd Texas had a thing to do in bringing that about. I don't deny that they followed us pretty closely after we got started. Among our casualties in this affair was Lieutenant Lorenzo J. Miner of Company B, originally of Company C, a splendid young man and a most excellent officer. In addition to his other efficient soldierly qualities, he deservedly had the reputation of being the best drill master in the regiment. I happened to see him on our retreat shortly before we arrived at the blockhouse. He was being helped off the field by Sergeant Amos Davis of Company C, and another soldier, one on each side supporting him. They were walking slowly. Miner's eyes were fixed on the ground, and he was deathly pale. I saw from his manner that he was badly hurt, but did not learn the extent of it till later. He was shot somewhere through the body. The wound proved mortal, and he died a few days after the fight. And so it was that after more than 3 years of brave and faithful service he was fated to lose his life in the last action the regiment was in, a small obscure affair among the rocks and bushes, and which, when mentioned in the general histories at all, is disposed of in a paragraph of about 4 lines. But a soldier in time of war has no control over his fate, and no option in the selection of the time when, nor the place where, it may be his lot to stack arms forever. I will now resume the account of what happened after we reached the blockhouse. It will be brief. We formed in line with the reinforcements that had come from Murfreesboro and advanced toward the train. We encountered no opposition. The enemy had set fire to the cars and then had hastily and entirely disappeared. I have recently discovered in a modern edition of the reports of the Adjutant General of Illinois, the date on the title page being 1901, that in the revised sketch of our regiment a recital has crept in, stating that in our subsequent advance we recaptured the train in time to prevent its destruction. How that statement got into the sketch I do not know, and I am sorry to be under the necessity of saying that it is not true. When we got back to the scene of the fight, the train was a mass of roaring flame, the resulting consequence being that every car was finally consumed. No matter how much it may hurt, it is always best to be fair and tell the truth. In the course of the day our troops all returned to Murfreesboro. Major Knowlton, who was now our regimental commander, gave us of the 61st permission to march back at will. That is, we could start when we got ready, singly or in squads, and not in regimental formation. So Bill Banfield and I started out to get something to eat, as we were very hungry. Since leaving Stevenson on the morning of the 14th, we had had no opportunity to cook anything, and had eaten nothing but some hardtack and raw bacon. Then that night we had left our haversacks on top of the cars when we got off the train to skirmish with the enemy, and never saw them again. And this was a special grievance for Bill and me. We each had a little money, and on the morning we left Stevenson had gone to a sutler's and made some purchases to insure us an extra good meal when we got back to Murfreesboro. I bought a little can of condensed milk, having always had a weakness for milk in coffee, while Bill, with a kind of queer taste, invested in a can of lobsters. One time that night, while sitting on the ground in the cold and dark, tired, hungry, and sleepy, waiting while our engineers patched a break in the railroad, Bill, with a view, I reckon, to cheering us both up, delivered himself in this wise: "This is a little tough, Stillwell, but just think of that bully dinner we'll have when we get back to Murfreesboro. You've got your can of condensed milk, and I've mine of lobsters. We'll have coffee with milk in it, and then, with some hardtack, we'll have a spread that will make up for this all right." But, alas, the best laid schemes of mice and men go oft astray. My precious condensed milk and the crustaceans aforesaid of Bill's doubtless went glimmering down the alimentary canal of some long-haired Texan to his great satisfaction. My wish at the time was that the darn lobsters might make the fellows sick, which they probably did. So Bill and I were now at the burning train, looking for something to take the place of our captured Belshazzar banquet. We found a car that was loaded with pickled pork in barrels, and getting a fence rail we finally succeeded, after some peril and much difficulty, in prying off one of the barrels, and it fell to the ground, bursting open as it did so, and scattering the blazing pieces of pork all around. We each got a portion, and then sat down on a big rock and proceeded to devour our respective chunks without further ceremony. The outside of the meat was burned to a coal, but we were hungry, all of it tasted mighty sweet, and we gnawed it just like dogs. At the close of the repast I took a look at Bill. His face was as black as tar from contact with the burnt pork, and in other respects his tout ensemble left much to be desired. I thought if I looked as depraved as Bill certainly did, it would be advisable to avoid any pocket looking-glass until after a thorough facial ablution with soft water and plenty of soap. Dinner over, we were soon ready for the march to camp, there being no dishes to wash, and started down the railroad track for Murfreesboro. We took our time, and didn't reach camp until about sundown. We were the last arrivals of Company D, and as there were all sorts of rumors afloat, we afterwards learned that Captain Keeley had become quite anxious about us. As we turned down our company street, I saw the captain standing in front of his tent, looking in our direction. After the affairs of the 4th and the 7th, I had taken much satisfaction in speaking to him of those events, in adopting the phraseology of the old chaplain, and had expressed myself several times in language like this: "And we smote them hip and thigh, even as Joash smote Boheel." But it was now necessary to amend my boastful statement, so as I approached Captain Keeley, and before anything else had been spoken, I made to him this announcement: "And they smote us hip and thigh, even as Joash smote Boheel." Keeley laughed, but it was a rather dry laugh, and he answered, "Well, I'm glad they didn't smite you boys, anyhow, but, great God, go wash your faces and clean up generally. You both look like the very devil himself." We passed on, complied with the captain's directions, and then I curled up in my dog tent and slept without a break until next morning. In concluding my account of this affair, it will be stated that most of our boys who were captured in the fight, and I think all the line officers who had the same bad luck, made their escape, singly or in little parties, not long thereafter. Their Confederate captors, on or about the day after our encounter, had hurriedly joined the army of General Hood, taking their prisoners with them. In their retreat from Tennessee on this occasion, the Confederates had a hard and perilous time. The guards of the captured Yankees were probably well nigh worn out, and it is likely that, on account of their crushing defeat at Nashville, they had also become discouraged and careless. Anyhow, the most of our fellows got away while Hood was yet on the north side of the Tennessee River. He crossed that stream with the wreck of his army on the 26th and 27th of December, and fell back into Mississippi. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 23. Murfreesboro, Winter of 1864-1865. Franklin, Spring and Summer of 1865. After the retreat of Hood from Nashville, matters became very quiet and uneventful with us at Murfreesboro. The regiment shifted its camp from inside of Fortress Rosecrans out into open ground on the outskirts of the town, and proceeded to build winter quarters. These consisted of log cabins like those we built at Little Rock the previous winter, only now the logs were cedar instead of pine. There were extensive cedar forests in the immediate vicinity of Murfreesboro, and we had no difficulty whatever in getting the material. And we had plenty of nice, fragrant cedar wood to burn in our fireplaces, which was much better than soggy Arkansas pine. And I remember with pleasure a matter connected with the rations we had in the forepart of the winter. For some reason or other, the supply of hardtack became practically exhausted, and we had little in the line of flour bread, even for some weeks after Hood retreated from Nashville. But in the country north of Murfreesboro was an abundance of corn, and there were plenty of water mills. So General Rousseau sent out foraging parties in that region and appropriated the corn, and set the mills to grinding it. And oh, what fine cornbread we had! We used to make ash cakes, and they were splendid. The method of making and cooking an ash cake was to mix a quantity of meal with proper proportions of water, grease, and salt, wrap the meal dough in some dampened paper or a clean wet cloth, then put it in the fire and cover it with hot ashes and coals. By testing with a sharp stick we could tell when the cake was done. Then we would yank it from the fire, scrape off the fragments of the covering and the adhering ashes, and then, with bacon broiled on the cedar coals and plenty of good strong coffee, we would have a dinner better than any, from my standpoint, that Delmonico's ever served up in its palmiest days. On February 4th, 1865, the non-veterans and recruits of the regiment came to us from Arkansas, and so we were once more all together, except a few that were in the Confederate prisons down south. We were all glad to see each other once more, and had many tales to swap about our respective experiences during our separation. On February 10th, Lieutenant Wallace resigned and returned to his home in Illinois. The chief reason for his resignation was on account of some private matter at home, which was giving him much anxiety and trouble. Further, the war in the region where we were was practically over, and there was nothing doing, with no prospect, so far as we knew, of any military activity for the regiment in the future. Wallace's resignation left Company D without a second lieutenant, as we then did not have enough enlisted men in the company to entitle us to a full complement of commissioned officers, and the place remained vacant for some months. On March 21st we left Murfreesboro by rail and went to Nashville, and thence to Franklin, about 20 miles south of Nashville, and on what was then called the Nashville and Decatur Railroad. A desperate and bloody battle occurred here between our forces under the command of General Schofield and the Confederates under General Hood on November 30th, only 2 days after our arrival at Murfreesboro. I have often wondered why it was that General Thomas, our department commander, did not send our regiment on our arrival at Nashville to reinforce Schofield instead of to Murfreesboro, for General Schofield certainly needed all the help he could get, but it is probable that General Thomas had some good reason for his action. When we arrived at Franklin, we relieved the regiment that was on duty there as a garrison, and it went somewhere else. It was the 75th Pennsylvania, and the officers and men composing it, so far as I saw, were all Germans, and they were fine, soldierly-looking fellows, too. From this time until we left Franklin in the following September, our regiment comprised all the Union force that was stationed at the town. Major Knowlton was in command of the post, and subject only to higher authorities at a distance. We were monarchs of all we surveyed. When we came to Franklin, the signs of the battle of November 30th were yet fresh and plentiful. As soon as time and opportunity afforded, I walked over the whole field, in fact several times, looking with deep interest at all the evidences of the battle. I remember especially the appearance of a scattered grove of young locust trees, which stood at a point opposite the right center of the Union line. For some hours the grove was right between the fire of both the Union and the Confederate lines, and the manner in which the trees had been riddled with musket balls was truly remarkable. It looked as if a snowbird could not have lived in that grove while the firing was in progress. General William A. Quarles of Tennessee was one of the Confederate generals who were wounded in this battle, and after incurring his wound was taken to the house of a Tennessee planter, Colonel McGavock, about a mile from Franklin near the Harpeth River. 2 or 3 other wounded Confederate officers of less rank were taken to the same place. When the Confederates retreated from Nashville, General Quarles and these other wounded officers were unable to accompany the army. They remained at McGavock's and were taken prisoners by our forces. They were put under a sort of parole of honor and allowed to remain where they were without being guarded. They had substantially recovered from their wounds at the time our regiment arrived at Franklin, and not long thereafter Captain Keeley came to me one day and handed me an order from Major Knowlton, which directed me to take a detail of 4 men with 2 ambulances and go to McGavock's and get General Quarles and the other Confederate officers who were there, and bring them into Franklin for the purpose of being sent to Nashville, and thence to the north to some military prison. I thereupon detailed Bill Banfield and 3 other boys, told them what our business was, and instructed them to brush up nicely and have their arms and accoutrements in first-class condition, and in general to be looking their best. Having obtained the ambulances with drivers, we climbed aboard and soon arrived at the fine residence of old Colonel McGavock. I went into the house, met the lady of the establishment, and inquired of her for General Quarles, and was informed that he was in an upper room. I requested the lady to give the general my compliments and tell him that I desired to see him. She disappeared, and soon the general walked into the room where I was awaiting him. He was a man slightly below medium stature, heavy set, black hair, piercing black eyes, and looked to be about 30 years old. He was a splendid-looking soldier. I stepped forward and saluted him, and briefly and courteously told him my business. "All right, Sergeant," he answered. "We'll be ready in a few minutes." Their preparations were soon completed, and we left the house. I assigned the general and one of the other officers to a seat near the front in one of the ambulances, and Bill Banfield and I occupied the seat behind them, and the remaining guards and prisoners rode in the other conveyance. There was only one remark made on the entire trip back to Franklin, and I'll mention it presently. We emerged from the woods into the Columbia pike at a point about 3/4 of a mile in front of our main line of works that had been charged repeatedly and desperately by the Confederates in the late battle. The ground sloped gently down towards the works, and for fully half a mile was as level as a house floor. I noticed that at the moment we reached the pike, General Quarles began to take an intense interest in the surroundings. He would lean forward and look to the right, to the front, to the left, and occasionally throw a hasty glance backward, but said nothing. Finally we passed through our works near the historic cotton gin, and the general drew a deep breath, leaned back against his seat, and said, "Well, by God, the next time I fight at Franklin, I want to let the Columbia pike severely alone." No one made any response, and the remainder of the journey was finished in silence. I duly delivered General Quarles and his fellow prisoners to Major Knowlton, and never saw any of them again. Early in April, a decisive military operations took place in Virginia. On the 3rd of that month, our forces marched into Richmond, and on the 9th, the army of General Lee surrendered to General Grant. At Franklin, we were on a telegraph line, and only about 20 miles from department headquarters, so the intelligence of those events was not long in reaching us. I am just unable to tell how profoundly gratified we were to hear of the capture of Richmond and of Lee's army. We were satisfied that those victories meant the speedy and triumphant end of the war. It had been a long, desperate, and bloody struggle, and frequently the final results looked doubtful and gloomy. But now there were signs in the sky that the darkness was gone, there were tokens in endless array, and the feeling among the common soldiers was one of heartfelt relief and satisfaction. But suddenly our joy was turned into the most distressing grief and mourning. Only a few days after we heard of Lee's surrender came the awful tidings of the foul murder of Mr. Lincoln. I well remember the manner of the men when the intelligence of the dastardly crime was flashed to us at Franklin. They seemed dazed and stunned, and were reluctant to believe it until the fact was confirmed beyond question. They sat around in camp under the trees, talking low and saying but little, as if the matter were one that made mere words utterly useless. But they were in a desperate frame of mind, and had there been the least appearance of exultation over the murder of Mr. Lincoln by any of the people of Franklin, the place would have been laid in ashes instanter. But the citizens seemed to understand the situation. They went into their houses and closed their doors, and the town looked as if deserted. To one who had been among the soldiers for some years, it was easy to comprehend and understand their feelings on this occasion. For the last 2 years of the war especially, the men had come to regard Mr. Lincoln with sentiments of veneration and love. To them he really was Father Abraham, with all that the term implied. And this regard was also entertained by men of high rank in the army. General Sherman, in speaking of Mr. Lincoln, says this, quote, "Of all the men I ever met, he seemed to possess more of the elements of greatness, combined with goodness, than any other." Memoirs of General W. T. Sherman, Revised Edition, Volume 2, page 328. For my part, I have been of the opinion for many years that Abraham Lincoln was the greatest man the world has ever known. In the latter part of June, the recruits of the 83rd, the 98th, and the 123rd Illinois Infantry were transferred to the 61st, making the old regiment about 900 strong. Company D received 46 of the transferred men, all of these being from the 83rd Illinois. And they were a fine set of boys, too. Their homes were in the main in northwestern Illinois, in the counties of Mercer, Rock Island, and Warren. They all had received a good common school education, were intelligent and prompt and cheerful in the discharge of their duties. They were good soldiers in every sense of the word. It is a little singular that, since the muster out of the regiment in the following September, I have never met a single one of those boys. The ranks of the regiment now being filled nearly to the maximum, the most of the vacancies that existed in the line of commissioned officers were filled just as promptly as circumstances would permit. Lieutenant Colonel Grass had been discharged on May 15, 1865, and Major Knowlton, who was now our ranking field officer, was on July 11th promoted to the position of colonel. He was the first and only colonel the regiment ever had. The vacancy of the lieutenant colonelcy of the regiment was never filled, for what reason I do not know. Captain Keeley was promoted major, and First Lieutenant Warren to captain of Company D in Keeley's stead, and thus it came to pass that on July 11th I received a commission as second lieutenant of our company, and on August 21st was promoted to first lieutenant. Soon after receiving my commission, Captain Warren was detailed on some special duty which took him away from Franklin for some weeks, and consequently, during his absence, I was the commanding officer of Company D. So far as ever came to my knowledge, I got along all right, and very pleasantly. It is a fact, at any rate, that I presented a more respectable appearance than that which was displayed during the brief time I held the position at Austin, Arkansas, in May, 1864. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 24, The Soldier's Pay, Rations, allusions to some of the useful lessons learned by service in the Army in time of war, courage in battle. This story is now drawing to a close, so I will here speak of some things of a general nature and which have not been heretofore mentioned except perhaps casually. One important feature in the life of a soldier was the matter of his pay, and a few words on that subject may not be out of place. When I enlisted in January 1862, the monthly pay of the enlisted men of a regiment of infantry was as follows: First sergeant $20, duty sergeants $17, corporals and privates $13. By act of Congress of May 1, 1864, the monthly pay of the enlisted men was increased, and from that date was as follows: First sergeant $24, duty sergeants $20, corporals $18, privates $16. That rate existed as long at least as we remained in the service. The first payment made to our regiment was on May 1, 1862, while we were in camp at Owl Creek, Tennessee. The amount I received was $49.40, and of this I sent $45 home to my father at the first opportunity. For a poor man, he was heavily in debt at the time of my enlistment, and was left without any boys to help him to do the work upon the farm. So I regarded it as my duty to send him every dollar of my pay that possibly could be spared, and did so as long as I was in the service. But he finally got out of debt during the war. He had good crops, and all manner of farm products brought high prices. So the war period was financially a prosperous one for him, and to be fair about it, I will say that he later repaid me when I was pursuing my law studies at the Albany, New York Law School, almost all the money I had sent him while in the Army. So the result really was that the money received by me as a soldier was what later enabled me to qualify as a lawyer. I have heretofore said in these reminiscences that the great standbys in the way of the food of the soldiers of the Western armies were coffee, sow belly, Yankee beans, and hardtack. But other articles of diet were also issued to us, some of which we liked, while others were flat failures. I have previously said something about the antipathy I had for rice. The French General Baron Gourgaud, in his Talks of Napoleon at St. Helena, page 240, records Napoleon as having said, "Rice is the best food for the soldier." Napoleon, in my opinion, was the greatest soldier that mankind ever produced, but all the same I emphatically dissent from his rice proposition. His remark may have been correct when applied to European soldiers of his time and place, but I know it wouldn't fit Western American boys of 1861-65. There were a few occasions when an article of diet was issued called desiccated potatoes. For desiccated, the boys promptly substituted desecrated, and desecrated potatoes was its name among the rank and file from start to finish. It consisted of Irish potatoes cut up fine and thoroughly dried. In appearance it much resembled the modern preparation called grape nuts. We would mix it in water, grease, and salt, and make it up into little cakes which we would fry, and they were first rate. There was a while when we were at Bolivar, Tennessee, that some stuff called compressed vegetables was issued to us, which the boys almost unanimously considered an awful fraud. It was composed of all sorts of vegetables pressed into small bales, in a solid mass and as dry as threshed straw. The conglomeration contained turnip tops, cabbage leaves, string beans, pod and all, onion blades, and possibly some of every other kind of a vegetable that ever grew in a garden. It came to the Army in small boxes, about the size of the Chinese tea boxes that were frequently seen in this country about 50 years ago. In the process of cooking it would swell up prodigiously, a great deal more so than rice. The Germans in the regiment would make big dishes of soup out of this baled hay, as we called it, and they liked it, but the native Americans after one trial wouldn't touch it. I think about the last box of it that was issued to our company was pitched into a ditch in the rear of the camp, and it soon got thoroughly soaked and loomed up about as big as a fair-sized haycock. Split peas were issued to us more or less during all the time we were in the service. My understanding was that they were the ordinary garden peas. They were split in two, dried, and about as hard as gravel, but they yielded to cooking, made excellent food, and we were all fond of them. In our opinion, when properly cooked, they were almost as good as Yankee beans. When our forces captured Little Rock in September 1863, we obtained possession, among other plunder, of quite a quantity of Confederate commissary stores. Among these was a copious supply of jerked beef. It consisted of narrow, thin strips of beef, which had been dried on scaffolds in the sun, and it is no exaggeration to say that it was almost as hard and dry as cottonwood chip. Our manner of eating it was simply to cut off a chunk about as big as one of our elongated musket balls, and proceed to chaw. It was rather a comical sight to see us in our cabins of a cold winter night, sitting by the fire, and all solemnly chawing away in profound silence on the Johnny's jerked beef. But if sufficiently masticated, it was nutritious and healthful, and we all liked it. I often thought it would have been a good thing if the government had made this kind of beef a permanent and regular addition to our rations. As long as kept in the dry, it would apparently keep indefinitely, and a piece big enough to last a soldier 2 or 3 days would take up but little space in a haversack. Passing from the topic of army rations, I will now take leave to say here, with sincerity and emphasis, that the best school to fit me for the practical affairs of life that I ever attended was in the old 61st Illinois during the Civil War. It would be too long a story to undertake to tell all the benefits derived from that experience, but a few will be alluded to. In the first place, when I was a boy at home, I was to some extent a spoiled child. I was exceedingly particular and finicky about my food. Fat meat I abhorred and wouldn't touch it, and on the other hand, when we had chicken to eat, the gizzard was claimed by me as my sole and exclusive tidbit, and Leander always got it. Let it be known that in the regiment these habits were gotten over so soon that I was astonished myself. The army in time of war is no place for a sissy boy. It will make a man of him quicker, in my opinion, than any other sort of experience he could undergo. And suffice it to say on the food question, that my life as a soldier forever cured me of being fastidious or fault-finding about what I had to eat. I have gone hungry too many times to give way to such weakness when sitting down in a comfortable room to a table provided with plenty that was good enough for any reasonable man. I have no patience with a person who is addicted to complaining or growling about his food. Some years ago there was an occasion when I took breakfast at a decent little hotel at a country way station on a railroad out in Kansas. It was an early breakfast, for the accommodation of guests who would leave on an early morning train, and there were only 2 at the table, a young traveling commercial man and myself. The drummer ordered, with other things, a couple of fried eggs, and that fellow sent the poor little dining room girl back with those eggs 3 times before he got them fitted to the exact shade of taste to suit his exquisite palate. And he did this, too, in a manner and words that were offensive and almost brutal. It was none of my business, so I kept my mouth shut and said nothing, but I would have given a reasonable sum to have been the proprietor of that hotel about 5 minutes. That fool would then have been ordered to get his grip and leave the house, and he would have left, too. I do not know how it may have been with other regiments in the matter now to be mentioned, but I presume it was substantially the same as in ours, and the course pursued with us had a direct tendency to make one indifferent as to the precise cut of his clothes. It is true that attention was paid to shoes, to that extent at least, that the quartermaster tried to give each man a pair that approximated to the number he wore, but coats, trousers, and the other clothes were piled up in separate heaps, and each man was just thrown the first garment on top of the heap. He took it and walked away. If it was an outrageous fit, he would swap with someone if possible, otherwise he got along as best he could. Now in civil life I have frequently been amused in noting some duddish young fellow in a little country store trying to fit himself out with a light summer coat or something similar. He would put on the garment, stand in front of a big looking-glass, twist himself into all sorts of shapes so as to get a view from every possible angle, then remove that one and call for another. Finally, after trying on about every coat in the house, he would leave without making a purchase, having found nothing that suited the exact contour of his delicately molded form. A very brief experience in a regiment that had a gruff old quartermaster would take the tuck out of that Beau Brummel in short order. Sometimes I have been, at a late hour on a stormy night, at a way station on some jerk-water railroad, waiting for a belated train with others in the same predicament. And it was comical to note the irritation of some of these fellows and the fuss they made about the train being late. The railroad and all the officers would be condemned and abused in the most savage terms on account of this little delay, and yet we were in a warm room, with benches to sit on, with full stomachs, and physically just as comfortable as we possibly could be. The thought would always occur to me on such episodes that if those kickers had to sit down in a dirt road in the mud, with a cold rain pelting down on them, and just endure all this until a broken bridge in front was fixed up so that the artillery and wagon train could get along, then a few incidents of that kind would be a benefit to them. And instances like the foregoing might be multiplied indefinitely. On the whole, life in the Army in a time of war tended to develop patience, contentment with the surroundings, and equanimity of temper and mind in general, and from the highest to the lowest, differing only in degree, it would bring out energy, prompt decision, intelligent action, and all the latent force of character a man possessed. I suppose in reminiscences of this nature one should give his impressions or views in relation to that much talked about subject, courage in battle. Now, in what I have to say on that head, I can speak advisedly mainly for myself only. I think that the principal thing that held me to the work was simply pride, and am of the opinion that it was the same thing with most of the common soldiers. A prominent American functionary some years ago said something about our people being too proud to fight. With the soldiers of the Civil War it was exactly the reverse. They were too proud to run, unless it was manifest that the situation was hopeless, and that for the time being nothing else could be done. And in the latter case, when the whole line goes back, there is no personal odium attaching to any one individual. They are all in the same boat. The idea of the influence of pride is well illustrated by an old-time war story as follows. A soldier on the firing line happened to notice a terribly affrighted rabbit running to the rear at the top of its speed. "Go to it, Cottontail," yelled the soldier. "I'd run too if I had no more reputation to lose than you have." It is true that in the first stages of the war the fighting qualities of American soldiers did not appear in altogether a favorable light, but at that time the fact is that the volunteer armies on both sides were not much better than mere armed mobs, and without discipline or cohesion. But those conditions didn't last long, and there was never but one Bull Run. Enoch Wallace was home on recruiting service some weeks in the fall of 1862, and when he rejoined the regiment he told me something my father said in a conversation that occurred between the two. They were talking about the war, battles, and topics of that sort, and in the course of their talk Enoch told me that my father said that, while he hoped his boy would come through the war all right, yet he would rather Leander should be killed dead while standing up and fighting like a man than that he should run and disgrace the family. I have no thought from the nature of the conversation as told to me by Enoch that my father made this remark with any intention of its being repeated to me. It was sudden and spontaneous, and just the way the old backwoodsman felt. But I never forgot it, and it helped me several times. For, to be perfectly frank about it, and tell the plain truth, I will set it down here that, so far as I was concerned, away down in the bottom of my heart, I just secretly dreaded a battle. But we were soldiers, and it was our business to fight when the time came. So the only thing to then do was to summon up our pride and resolution and face the ordeal with all the fortitude we could command. And while I admit the existence of this feeling of dread before the fight, yet it is also true that when it was on, and one was in the thick of it with the smell of gunpowder permeating his whole system, then a signal change comes over a man. He is seized with a furious desire to kill. There are his foes right in plain view. Give it to 'em. D-them, and for the time being he becomes almost oblivious to the sense of danger. And while it was only human nature to dread a battle, and I think it would be mere affectation to deny it, yet I also know that we common soldiers strongly felt that when fighting did break loose close at hand, or within the general scope of our operations, then we ought to be in it with the others and doing our part. That was what we were there for, and somehow a soldier didn't feel just right for fighting to be going on all around him or in his vicinity, and he doing nothing but lying back somewhere eating government rations. But all things considered, the best definition of true courage I have ever read is that given by General Sherman in his memoirs as follows: "I would define true courage," he says, "to be a perfect sensibility of the measure of danger and a mental willingness to endure it." Sherman's Memoirs, Revised Edition, Volume 2, page 395. But I will further say in this connection that in my opinion much depends sometimes, especially at a critical moment, on the commander of the men who is right on the ground, or close at hand. This is shown by the result attained by General Milroy in the incident I have previously mentioned, and on a larger scale, the inspiring conduct of General Sheridan at the Battle of Cedar Creek, Virginia, is probably the most striking example in modern history of what a brave and resolute leader of men can accomplish under circumstances when apparently all is lost. And on the other hand, I think there is no doubt that the Battle of Wilson's Creek, Missouri, on August 10, 1861, was a Union victory up to the time of the death of General Lyon, and would have remained such if the officer who succeeded Lyon had possessed the nerve of his fallen chief. But he didn't, and so he marched our troops off the field, retreated from a beaten enemy, and hence Wilson's Creek figures in history as a Confederate victory. See The Lyon Campaign by Eugene F. Weir, pages 324 to 339. I have read somewhere this saying of Bonaparte's: "An army of deer commanded by a lion is better than an army of lions commanded by a deer." While that statement is only figurative in its nature, it is, however, a strong epigrammatic expression of the fact that the commander of soldiers in battle should be, above all other things, a forcible, determined, and brave man. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. The Story of a Common Soldier of Army Life in the Civil War, 1861-1865, by Leander Stillwell. Chapter 25. Franklin, Summer of 1865. Mustered out September 8, 1865. Received final payment at Springfield, Illinois, September 27, 1865. The regiment breaks ranks forever. Soldiering at Franklin, Tennessee, in May, June, July, and August 1865 was simply of a picnic kind. The war was over in that region, and everything there was as quiet and peaceful as it was at home in Illinois. Picket guards were dispensed with, and the only guard duty required was a small detail for the colors at regimental headquarters, and a similar one over our commissary stores. However, it was deemed necessary for the health of the men to maintain company drills to a certain extent, but they were light and easy. Near the camp was a fine bluegrass pasture field, containing in a scattered, irregular form numerous large and magnificent hard maples, and the drilling was done in this field. Captain Warren was somewhat portly, and not fond of strenuous exercise anyhow, so all the drilling Company D had at Franklin was conducted by myself, but I rather liked it. With the accession of those 83rd Illinois men, the old company was about as big and strong as it was at Camp Carrollton, and it looked fine. But to tell the truth, it is highly probable that we put in fully as much time lying on the bluegrass under the shade of those grand old maples as we did in company evolutions. Sometime during the course of the summer a middle-aged widow lady named House began conducting a sort of private boarding establishment at her residence in the city, and Colonel Knowlton, Major Keeley, and several others of the line officers, including myself, took our meals at this place during the remainder of our stay at Franklin. Among the boarders were 2 or 3 gentlemen also of the name of House, and who were brothers-in-law of our hostess. They had all served in Forrest's cavalry as commissioned officers, and were courteous and elegant gentlemen. We would all sit down together at the table of Mrs. House, with that lady at the head, and talk and laugh and joke with each other, as if we had been comrades and friends all our lives. And yet, during the 4 years just preceding, the Union and the Confederate soldiers thus mingled together in friendship and amity had been doing their very best to kill one another. But in our conversation we carefully avoided anything in the nature of political discussion about the war, and in general each side refrained from saying anything on that subject which might grate on the feelings of the other. On September 4th, 1865, the regiment left Franklin and went by rail to Nashville for the purpose of being mustered out of the service. There were some unavoidable delays connected with the business, and it was not officially consummated until September 8th. In the forenoon of the following day, we left Nashville on the cars on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for Springfield, Illinois, where we were to receive our final payment and certificates of discharge. Early on Sunday morning, September 10th, we crossed the Ohio River at Louisville, Kentucky, on a ferry boat to Jeffersonville, Indiana. This boat was provided with a railroad track extending from bow to stern, and so arranged that when the boat landed at either bank, the rails laid along the lower deck of the boat would closely connect with the railroad track on the land. This ferry transferred our train in sections, and thus obviated any necessity for the men to leave the cars. The ferrying process did not take long, and we were soon speeding through southern Indiana. As stated, it was Sunday, and a bright, beautiful autumn day. As I have hereinbefore mentioned, our train consisted of box cars, except one coach for the commissioned officers, and all the men who could find room had taken, from preference, seats on top of the cars. Much of southern Indiana is rugged and broken, and in 1865 was wild, heavily timbered, and the most of the farmhouses were of the backwoods class. We soon began to see little groups of the country people in farm wagons or on foot, making their way to Sunday school and church. Women, young girls, and children predominated, all dressed in their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes. And how the women and girls cheered us and waved their handkerchiefs! And didn't we yell! It was self-evident that we were in God's country once more. These were the first demonstrations of that kind the old regiment had seen since the girls of Monticello Seminary in February, 1862, lined the fences by the roadside and made similar manifestations of patriotism and goodwill. We arrived at Indianapolis about noon. There got off the cars and went in a body to a soldiers' home close at hand, where we had a fine dinner, thence back to the old train, which thundered on the rest of the day and that night, arriving at Springfield the following day, the 11th. Here we marched out to Camp Butler, near the city, and went into camp. And now another annoying delay occurred, this time being in the matter of our final payment. What the particular cause was I do not know. Probably the paymasters were so busy right then that they couldn't get around to us. The most of us, that is the old original regiment, were here within 60 or 70 miles of our homes, and to be compelled to just lie around and wait here at Camp Butler was rather trying. But the boys were patient, and on the whole endured the situation with commendable equanimity. But the day it came at last, and in the forenoon of September 27th we fell in line by companies, and each company in its turn marched to the paymaster's tent near regimental headquarters. The roll of the company would be called in alphabetical order, and each man, as his name was called, would answer and step forward to the paymaster's table. That officer would lay on the table before the man the sum of money he was entitled to, and with it his certificate of discharge from the Army, duly signed by the proper officials. The closing of the hand of the soldier over that piece of paper was the final act in the drama that ended his career as a soldier of the Civil War. Now he was a civilian, free to come and go as he listed. Farewell to the morning drum beats, taps, roll calls, drills, marches, battles, and all the other incidents and events of a soldier's life. The serried ranks, with flags displayed, the bugle's thrilling blast, the charge, the thunderous cannonade, the din and shout were past. The scattering out process promptly began after we received our pay and discharges. I left Springfield early the following day, the 28th, on the Chicago, Alton, and St. Louis Railroad, and went to Alton. Here I luckily found a teamster who was in the act of starting with his wagon and team to Jerseyville, and I rode with him to that place, arriving there about the middle of the afternoon. I now hunted diligently to find some farm wagon that might be going to the vicinity of home, but found none. While so engaged, to my surprise and delight, I met the old chaplain, B.B. Hamilton. As heretofore stated, he had resigned during the previous March, and had been at home for some months. His greeting to me was in his old-fashioned style. "Son of Jeremiah!" he exclaimed as he extended his hand, "why comest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness?" I promptly informed him, in effect, that my coming was regular and legitimate, and that the "few sheep" of the old regiment were forever through and done with a shepherd. Hamilton did not reside in Jerseyville, but had just arrived there from his home in Greene County, and, like me, was trying to find some farmer's conveyance to take him about 5 miles into the country to the home of an old friend. I ascertained that his route, as far as he went, was the same as mine, so I proposed that we should strike out on foot, but he didn't entertain the proposition with much enthusiasm. "Son of Jeremiah," said he, "you will find that a walk of 9 miles, the distance to my father's, will be a great weariness to the flesh on this warm day." But I considered it a mere pleasure walk, and was determined to go, so he finally concluded to do likewise. I left my valise in the care of a Jerseyville merchant, and with no baggage except my sword and belt, we proceeded to "hit the dirt." I took off my coat, slung it over one shoulder, unsnapped my sword with the scabbard from the belt, and shouldered it also. Our walk was a pleasant and most agreeable one, as we had much to talk about that was interesting to both. When we arrived at the mouth of the lane that led to the house of the chaplain's friend, we shook hands, and I bade him good-bye, but fully expected to meet him many times later. But our paths in life diverged, and I never saw him again. I arrived at the little village of Otterville about sundown. It was a very small place in 1865. There was just one store, which also contained the post office, a blacksmith shop, the old stone schoolhouse, a church, and perhaps a dozen or so private dwellings. There were no sidewalks, and I stalked up the middle of the one street the town afforded, with my sword poised on my shoulder musket fashion, and feeling happy and proud. I looked eagerly around as I passed along, hoping to see some old friend. As I went by the store, a man who was seated therein on the counter leaned forward and looked at me, but said nothing. A little further up the street a big dog sprang off the porch of a house, ran out to the little gate in front, and standing on his hind legs, with his fore paws on the palings, barked at me loudly and persistently. But I attracted no further attention. Many of the regiments that were mustered out soon after the close of the war received at home gorgeous receptions. They marched under triumphal arches, decorated with flags and garlands of flowers, while brass bands blared, and thousands of people cheered and gave them a most enthusiastic welcome home. But the poor old 61st Illinois was among the late arrivals. The discharged soldiers were now numerous and common, and no longer a novelty. Personally, I didn't care, rather really preferred to come back home modestly and quietly, and without any fuss and feathers whatever. Still, I would have felt better to have met at least one person as I passed through the little village, who would have given me a hearty handshake and said he was glad to see me home, safe from the war. But it's all right, for many such were met later. I now had only 2 miles to go, and was soon at the dear old boyhood home. My folks were expecting me, so they were not taken by surprise. There was no scene when we met, nor any effusive display, but we all had a feeling of profound contentment and satisfaction, which was too deep to be expressed by mere words. When I returned home, I found that the farm work my father was then engaged in was cutting up and shocking corn. So, the morning after my arrival, September 29th, I doffed my uniform of first lieutenant, put on some of father's old clothes, armed myself with a corn knife, and proceeded to wage war on the standing corn. The feeling I had while engaged in this work was sort of queer. It almost seemed sometimes as if I had been away only a day or two, and had just taken up the farm work where I had left off. Here this story will close. In conclusion, I will say that in civil life people have been good to me. I have been honored with different positions of trust, importance, and responsibility, and which I have reason to believe I filled to the satisfaction of the public. I am proud of the fact of having been deemed worthy to fill those different places. But, while that is so, I will further say in absolute sincerity that to me, my humble career as a soldier in the 61st Illinois during the war for the Union is the record that I prize the highest of all, and is the proudest recollection of my life. End of chapter 25. End of the story of a common soldier, of army life in the Civil War, 1861, 1865.